Enggak usah. Tes. Oh, nggak bisa mas. Tes, kedengaran nggak Pak? Tes. Apa dingin nggak kan? Tes 1 2 3. Tes 1 2 3. Tes 1 2 3. Tes. Gimana nih mas? Udah. Tes. Udah kedengar Pak? Tes.
Ya, udah diganti kok. Udah diganti.
Cek 1 2 3.
Tes 1 2 3.
Tidak Pak. Halo.
mohon dengan hormat kepada Bapak Ismail untuk membuka audio dan juga kamera video. Kita sedang melakukan pengecekan bersama.
Oh iya. Oke. Soalnya moderatornya tadi ngulang-ngulang terus, reply terus. Ya. Ya, sama-sama ya. Ya.
Kok kayaknya mati loh. Mati ya? Apa dari sananya? Penuh kosong aja nggak ada ini? Nggak ada.
Iya, masih preparing.
Belum ya?
menghadirkan inovasi fitur deal sekitarmu dan berbagai promo menarik, sehingga meningkatkan jumlah transaksi para mitra. ShopeePay, mudah, aman, dan efisien.
Gentlemen, before we begin with this monumental event, please allow me to inform you several rules for closing Indonesia Fintech Summit 2020 and Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020 virtual event. First, for all participants, please register yourself via the Google form link available in the chat box column on the Zoom platform. Second, all panelists and participants must log in using the username format of the institution's name _ full name. Third, all panelists should turn on their videos and keep the sound mute at all times. Fourth, all the cameras of the participants will be turned off and the sounds will be mute during the event. Fifth, during the event, panelists and participants are encouraged to stand up when we sing the national anthem of Indonesia. After singing the national anthem, all panelists and participants are requested to be seated. Sixth, please do not close your session or log out during the event. You can log out after the event finish. On your Zoom platform, we have simultaneous interpretation from English to Bahasa Indonesia and vice versa. Please go to Interpretation Globe and select English or Bahasa Indonesia. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to closing ceremony of Indonesia Fintech Summit 2020 and Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020. This year we are going to virtual, although we cannot see each other physically. We are still connected through technology. I wish that everyone is healthy and well to follow closing ceremony of Indonesia Fintech Summit 2020 and Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020. This event has been taking place from 11 to 25th November 2020, where the opening was carried out on 11 November by His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Indonesia, Bapak Joko Widodo. The event draws the theme to survive and to thrive, accelerating national economic recovery through concerted efforts in the digitization of Indonesia's financial services. Fintech has provided positive contribution to Indonesia's economic recovery and has dealt its way to reduce the economic impact of COVID-19. The summit itself will focus on measures to fasten digitization of Indonesia's financial services with the objective to accelerate national economic recovery. Ladies and gentlemen, let us begin the closing ceremony of Indonesia Fintech Summit 2020 and Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020 with the national anthem of the Republic of Indonesia, Indonesia Raya. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise. Hadirin dimohon untuk duduk kembali. Yang terhormat Wakil Presiden Republik Indonesia Bapak Kiai Haji Maruf Amin, Deputi Gubernur Senior Bank Indonesia Ibu Destri Damayanti, beserta anggota Dewan Gubernur Bank Indonesia Bapak Sugeng, Wakil Ketua Dewan Komisioner Otoritas Jasa Keuangan Republik Indonesia Ibu Nurhaida, beserta jajaran anggota Dewan Komisioner Otoritas Jasa Keuangan Republik Indonesia Bapak Dodi Budi Waluyo. Yang kami hormati Menteri Komunikasi dan Informatika Republik Indonesia yang diwakilkan oleh PLT Sekretaris Jenderal Kementerian Komunikasi dan Informatika Republik Indonesia Bapak Ismail, Managing Director Investment Temasek Ms. Connie Chen, pejabat di lingkungan Bank Indonesia dan Otoritas Jasa Keuangan Republik Indonesia. Para pelaku industri jasa keuangan, moderator dan pembicara, serta hadirin yang berbahagia, baik yang hadir secara fisik maupun secara virtual dari seluruh wilayah tanah air dan mancanegara. Selamat pagi dan selamat datang pada acara penutupan Indonesia Fintech Summit 2020 dan Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020. Bapak dan Ibu hadirin sekalian, mengawali acara pada hari ini, kita akan menyaksikan sambutan dari Wakil Ketua Dewan Komisioner Otoritas Jasa Keuangan Republik Indonesia, Ibu Nurhaida. Kepada Ibu Nurhaida, kami silakan.
Yang saya hormati Bapak Wakil Presiden Republik Indonesia, yang saya hormati Deputi Gubernur Senior Bank Indonesia, Ibu Destri, yang saya hormati Deputi Gubernur Bank Indonesia, Bapak Sugeng, Bapak Dodi, dan jajaran, yang saya hormati rekan-rekan di Otoritas Jasa Keuangan, dan seluruh peserta yang hadir pada acara penutupan Fintech Summit dan Pekan Fintech Nasional pada pagi hari ini. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi dan salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Pertama-tama, marilah kita panjatkan puji dan syukur kehadirat Tuhan Yang Maha Kuasa atas berkah dan limpahan rahmat-Nya. Kita semua telah sampai di penghujung acara Indonesia Fintech Summit dan Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020. Atas nama Otoritas Jasa Keuangan, kami mengucapkan terima kasih dan juga merasa begitu antusias untuk dapat berpartisipasi dalam pertumbuhan fintech dan ekosistem keuangan digital yang berkesinambungan di Indonesia sebagai bentuk dukungan kepada generasi muda Indonesia untuk tetap berkarya. OJK mendorong kolaborasi antara lembaga jasa keuangan dengan penyelenggara inovasi keuangan digital agar tercipta sinergi dalam mendorong ekonomi, dalam memberdayakan UMKM melalui akses modal yang lebih fleksibel tentunya dan juga lebih mudah, dalam juga memutar roda ekonomi menjadi lebih cepat dan lebih besar, serta menciptakan lapangan kerja baru bagi seluruh masyarakat Indonesia. Dan tentu kita harapkan ini bisa mengentaskan kemiskinan di Indonesia. Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati, pemerintah dan seluruh pelaku ekosistem keuangan digital di Indonesia harus senantiasa berkolaborasi untuk memajukan inovasi digital melalui adopsi teknologi dalam menunjang pemulihan ekonomi nasional. Seperti kita perlu memperluas akses pemasaran e-commerce, serta menjadi solusi bagi kebutuhan akses keuangan untuk masyarakat dan pelaku usaha, terutama UMKM. Dengan adanya kolaborasi ini, pembentukan ekosistem keuangan digital di Indonesia akan tumbuh secara cepat, secara berkesinambungan, dan juga secara inklusif. Untuk itulah pada kesempatan ini, OJK memiliki peluang untuk berkolaborasi dalam menciptakan pertumbuhan berkelanjutan bagi fintech dan ekosistem keuangan digital di Indonesia. Dengan melibatkan seluruh elemen ekosistem keuangan digital seperti pemerintah, penyelenggara fintech, lembaga jasa keuangan, juga tentu asosiasi fintech, percepatan pembentukan ekosistem keuangan digital di Indonesia yang berkesinambungan dan inklusif akan bisa kita laksanakan. Bapak Ibu sekalian, perubahan teknologi yang pesat juga mendorong perkembangan fenomena ekonomi berbagi atau kita sebut sharing economy. Melalui beberapa kegiatan yang kita sudah lakukan atau kita sudah alami selama ini, ada ekonomi berbasis peer-to-peer atau peer-to-peer lending yang sudah ada ketentuannya, hingga juga business to business, dan fenomena ini telah terjadi. Kita sudah punya peraturannya dan kita harap nanti akan terus berkembang. Jika kita tidak siap akan perubahan yang terjadi, maka fenomena tersebut tentu akan memberikan dampak disrupsi di berbagai industri, seperti misalnya media, akomodasi, telekomunikasi, transportasi, perdagangan, dan juga keuangan. Kami di OJK berkomitmen untuk membantu mempercepat perkembangan industri fintech ini. Salah satunya dengan menyediakan layanan online terhadap perizinan ataupun pendaftaran dari fintech selama masa pandemi COVID-19 ini. Jadi kami memberikan layanan online, tidak harus tatap muka, tidak harus ketemu fisik, tetapi pendaftaran bisa dilakukan secara online. Kami juga setelah mempunyai roadmap atau peta jalan dalam rangka pengembangan fintech yang ada di Indonesia. Nah, ini kami lakukan guna mendorong percepatan perkembangan industri fintech itu sendiri yang telah menjadi salah satu visi di dalam visinya OJK, kami sebagai regulator. Marilah kita semuanya, saya ingin mengajak Bapak Ibu semua bersatu untuk senantiasa mendukung perkembangan inovasi keuangan digital ini. Tentu kita harapkan inovasi keuangan digital yang berkembang adalah inovasi keuangan digital yang bertanggung jawab, serta mengedepankan perlindungan konsumen untuk mempercepat pemulihan ekonomi nasional. Saya juga ingin mengucapkan terima kasih atas kolaborasi yang sangat baik antara OJK, kemudian dengan Bank Indonesia, dengan Asosiasi Fintech Indonesia atau AFTEK, dan juga dengan AFSI, Asosiasi Fintech Syariah Indonesia. Serta juga kolaborasi yang selama ini juga terjalin dengan seluruh stakeholders di industri fintech. Dengan juga pada kesempatan ini, saya ingin menyampaikan terima kasih kepada seluruh pembicara selama Pekan Fintech Nasional ini, maupun kepada para peserta yang telah terlibat selama beberapa hari sejak 11 November sampai 25 November 2020 ini. Dapat kami informasikan pula secara statistik, mungkin ini sebagai informasi kepada Bapak Ibu semua, selama Pekan Fintech Nasional dan juga Fintech Summit, kita punya data bahwa sekitar 8,62 juta jumlah orang yang melihat dan membaca ragam informasi di Indonesia Fintech Summit dan di Pekan Fintech Nasional di media. Ini termasuk di medsos. Ya. Kemudian ada 13,6 juta jumlah pengguna dari penyelenggara fintech yang berpartisipasi sepanjang Pekan Fintech Nasional ini. Kemudian ada 4,5 triliun nilai transaksi dari penyelenggara fintech yang berpartisipasi selama Pekan Fintech ini. Kemudian 39.500 lebih total attendees sesi virtual dan webinar. Ada 41 webinar edukatif selama Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020. Kemudian ada 180 lebih pembicara nasional maupun internasional. Dan juga ada 40 penyelenggara keuangan digital yang berpartisipasi. Tentu ini merupakan suatu prestasi yang saya juga sangat apresiasi kepada seluruh kita semua, termasuk juga tentunya kepada penyelenggara. Demikian akhir kata, kami mohon maaf apabila dalam kegiatan Pekan Fintech Nasional ini ada hal-hal yang kurang berkenan. Mudah-mudahan apa yang kita lakukan bisa membangun ekosistem yang lebih cepat di industri keuangan digital kita. Demikian ingin saya sampaikan sebagai sambutan pembuka. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Ya, terima kasih atas sambutan yang luar biasa pada pagi hari ini kepada Ibu Nur Haida. Bapak dan Ibu yang kami hormati, selanjutnya kita akan menyaksikan bersama opening speech Menteri Komunikasi dan Informatika Republik Indonesia yang akan disampaikan oleh PLT Sekretaris Jenderal Kementerian Komunikasi dan Informatika Republik Indonesia, Bapak Ismail. Kepada Bapak Ismail, kami silahkan.
Baik, terima kasih. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera buat kita semua. Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Bapak Wakil Presiden yang kami hormati, Ibu Destri Damayanti, Deputi Senior Gubernur Bank Indonesia, Ibu Nur Haida, Wakil Ketua Dewan Komisioner Otoritas Jasa Keuangan, Mr. Ahmed M. Said, Vice President Operation Asian Development Bank, Mr. Andy Dervisi, Global Head of Fintech Investment International Finance and Corporation, Ms. Connie Chan, Managing Director Investment Temasek, serta Bapak Ibu hadirin sekalian yang saya hormati. Selamat pagi dan salam semangat buat kita semua, sehat selalu. Izinkan saya membacakan sambutan yang sudah disiapkan oleh Bapak Menteri pada pagi hari ini dan permohonan maaf beliau karena harus mendampingi Bapak Presiden di Istana pagi hari ini dan menugaskan kepada kami untuk menyampaikan sambutan beliau ini. Selama 2 minggu berturut-turut, perhelatan Pekan Fintech PFN telah diikuti oleh lebih dari 28.000 peserta. Ada 180 pembicara internasional dan nasional dengan lebih dari 60 sesi virtual. PFN membuktikan bahwa pandemi COVID-19 bukanlah halangan untuk terus produktif. PFN justru menunjukkan bahwa Indonesia merupakan bangsa besar yang resilient dan kreatif dalam menghadapi beragam tantangan yang ada. Saya ucapkan selamat kepada penyelenggara yang telah secara sukses mengadakan PFN. Semoga semangat resiliensi ini terus menyala dalam upaya memulihkan kesehatan dan membangkitkan perekonomian Indonesia. Bapak, Ibu hadirin yang berbahagia, Indonesia saat ini sedang bertransformasi secara masif. Pandemi COVID-19 tidak hanya mengubah peta perekonomian, namun juga kehidupan berbangsa dan bernegara. Asosiasi Penyelenggara Jasa Internet Indonesia, APJI, pada laporan statistik pengguna internet 2020 menyampaikan peningkatan jumlah pengguna internet sebesar 25,5 juta atau 8,9% dibandingkan tahun 2019. Masyarakat Telekomunikasi Indonesia atau Mastel juga terus melaporkan peningkatan pemanfaatan jaringan tetap internet atau fixed internet broadband sebesar 28% pada kuartal kedua tahun 2020. Peningkatan pemanfaatan internet tersebut berbanding lurus dengan data transaksi ekonomi digital yang juga melesat naik. Bank Indonesia sebagaimana dikutip harian Kompas mencatat realisasi transaksi uang elektronik sebesar 127 triliun rupiah hingga Agustus 2020. Sedangkan pada transaksi penyedia jasa lending financial technology, Otoritas Jasa Keuangan mencatat tingkat penyaluran pinjaman sebesar 128,7 triliun rupiah dengan tingkat pertumbuhan year on year mencapai 113% pada September 2020. Capaian ini menunjukkan posisi strategis pemanfaatan teknologi untuk menunjang pemulihan dan percepatan ekonomi Indonesia. Hal ini selaras dengan arahan Presiden Joko Widodo dalam menempuh pendekatan kesehatan dan ekonomi secara paralel melalui penerapan gas dan rem kebijakan. Riset Financial Times menunjukkan pendekatan gas dan rem yang ditetapkan Indonesia berhasil dengan baik, di mana Indonesia didapuk menjadi salah satu dari negara-negara di kawasan Asia yang berhasil mengembangkan penanganan pandemi COVID-19 sembari menjaga kestabilan perekonomian, seperti negara-negara yang lain yaitu Jepang, Vietnam, dan Korea Selatan. Bapak, Ibu, hadirin yang saya hormati, dalam upaya optimalisasi ekosistem ekonomi digital, perlu dilakukan peningkatan indeks inklusi dan literasi keuangan, serta peningkatan peran financial technology. Menyadari kebutuhan dan potensi yang ada, Presiden Joko Widodo memberikan mandat untuk melakukan percepatan transformasi digital yang diimplementasikan oleh Kementerian Kominfo melalui 4 kebijakan konstruktif dari hulu ke hilir, yaitu yang pertama, perluasan pembangunan infrastruktur telekomunikasi yang bertujuan untuk menjamin pemenuhan kebutuhan konektivitas internet di seluruh penjuru Nusantara. Hal ini dilakukan melalui penyelesaian pembangunan Base Transmission System atau BTS di 12.548 desa atau kelurahan yang belum terjangkau jaringan 4G. Di tahun 2022, ini akan diselesaikan seluruhnya pembangunan 12.548 BTS tersebut. Kementerian Kominfo juga merencanakan peluncuran satelit multifungsi Satria untuk menyediakan 150.000 titik layanan akses publik di tahun 2023. Kebijakan kedua dalam konteks transformasi digital ini adalah pengembangan dan adopsi teknologi baru, seperti jaringan 5G, guna penyediaan konektivitas digital yang lebih memadai dalam fasilitasi pengembangan teknologi yang semakin beragam, utamanya dalam bidang transaksi dan pengembangan ekonomi digital. Kebijakan ketiga adalah pengembangan kapasitas sumber daya manusia melalui berbagai program pendampingan seperti UMKM, Go Online, Nexticon, serta gerakan 1000 startup digital yang bertujuan untuk mewujudkan ekosistem ekonomi digital yang inklusif untuk seluruh lapisan masyarakat. Kebijakan keempat adalah penuntasan legislasi primer, seperti rancangan Undang-Undang Perlindungan Data Pribadi, guna melindungi baik pengguna maupun penyedia jasa dalam transaksi digital, serta berkolaborasi dengan berbagai negara lain melalui forum-forum internasional untuk pengembangan ekosistem ekonomi digital secara berkelanjutan. Bapak, Ibu, hadirin yang saya hormati, Bank Dunia memproyeksikan Indonesia akan menjadi salah satu negara dengan kekuatan ekonomi terbesar kelima dengan PDB 9.100 miliar US dollar pada tahun 2045 mendatang. Kegiatan ekonomi digital memiliki peran yang sangat strategis dalam perwujudannya, terlebih dengan adopsi pemanfaatan teknologi digital yang semakin masif. Melalui 4 prioritas kebijakan transformasi digital tersebut, akan dilakukan kolaborasi yang bernafaskan semangat transformasi. Kita dapat wujudkan melalui pengembangan industri ekonomi digital yang inklusif, produktif, dan solutif. Akhir kata, mari kita bersinergi untuk mewujudkan Indonesia sebagai the digital energy of Asia. Terima kasih. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih kepada Bapak Ismail. Bapak dan Ibu hadirin sekalian, selanjutnya kita akan simak bersama visionary speech yang akan disampaikan oleh Deputi Gubernur Senior Bank Indonesia, Ibu Destri Damayanti. Kepada Ibu Destri Damayanti, kami silahkan.
Terima kasih. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Yang terhormat Wakil Presiden Republik Indonesia, Bapak Kiai Haji Ma'ruf Amin. Yang saya hormati Ibu Nur Haidah, Wakil Ketua Dewan Komisioner OJK, Bapak Deputi Gubernur Sugeng, Bapak Deputi Gubernur Dodi, dan juga Bapak Sekjen Menteri Komunikasi dan Informatika Republik Indonesia, Bapak Ismail MT, dan yang kami banggakan, seluruh para pelaku industri fintech dan seluruh hadirin dan undangan yang berbahagia. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, salam, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan. Selamat pagi dan salam sehat. Pertama-tama kami mengucapkan terima kasih yang setinggi-tingginya kepada pemerintah Republik Indonesia yang telah mendukung penyelenggaraan Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020 dan Indonesia Fintech Summit 2020 yang berlangsung dari tanggal 11 hingga 25 November 2020. Kami menghaturkan terima kasih kepada Bapak Wakil Presiden Republik Indonesia yang telah berkenan hadir menutup Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020 dan Indonesia Fintech Summit 2020 serta menyampaikan keynote speech pada pagi hari ini. Dan juga terima kasih, tadi kami sudah mendengarkan keynote speech dari Bapak Menteri Komunikasi dan Informatika, Bapak Joni G. Plate yang dibacakan oleh Bapak Sekjen. Terima kasih untuk dukungan dari pemerintah dalam rangka memberikan opening speech pada pagi hari ini. Kami juga memberikan apresiasi kepada para inovator dan para penggerak industri fintech di Indonesia yang dikoordinasikan oleh Asosiasi Fintech Indonesia atau AFTEC dan Asosiasi Fintech Syariah Indonesia atau AFSI yang telah menyelenggarakan kegiatan ini dengan baik dan lancar dan telah mendapat sambutan yang antusias dari masyarakat. Berbagai kegiatan telah diselenggarakan selama Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020 dan Indonesia Fintech Summit 2020. Pada pembukaan di tanggal 11 November yang lalu, Bapak Presiden Republik Indonesia telah memberikan keynote speech yang diawali dengan opening speech oleh Menteri Koordinator Bidang Perekonomian dan dilanjutkan dengan Fintech Visionary Talk dengan narasumber Gubernur BI, Ketua Dewan Komisioner OJK, dan Menteri Keuangan Republik Indonesia. Dan pada tanggal 11 hingga 12 November 2020 telah dilaksanakan Indonesia Fintech Summit 2020 berupa penyelenggaraan webinar yang terdiri dari sesi plenary dan sesi breakout. Dan webinar tersebut menghadirkan banyak sekali pembicara yang kompeten, baik dari luar negeri maupun dari dalam negeri. Dan acara ini diselenggarakan menggunakan platform Zoom meeting, dan disiarkan juga melalui siaran live YouTube dan Instagram yang disambut secara antusias oleh masyarakat. Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020 terdiri dari beberapa kegiatan individual, inisiatif anggota AFTEK dan AFSI, antara lain Expert Gym, Fintech Story, Fintech Talk, Media Clinic, Expert Lab, Roundtable Discussion. Dan topik yang dibahas terkait Fintech seperti Data Identity and Protection, EKYC, Alternative Financing, MSMEs Finance dalam 13 sesi kegiatan. Bapak Ibu sekalian, izinkan saya membaca sedikit summary terkait dengan statistik penyelenggaraan selama 2 pekan ini. Kalau kita lihat dari jumlah pengunjung, ada 8,62 juta pengunjung yang melihat dan membaca ragam informasi IFS dan PFN di seluruh media yang telah kami sebutkan di atas. Kemudian juga kalau kita lihat dari total attendees untuk seri virtual dan webinar, itu mencapai lebih dari 39.500. Dan menarik lagi, kalau kita lihat dari nilai transaksi dari penyelenggara fintech yang berpartisipasi sepanjang PFN ini mencapai 4,5 triliun. Dan ada 40 penyelenggara keuangan digital yang berpartisipasi. Kemudian ada 180 lebih pembicara nasional dan internasional. Dan ada 24 promosi berupa cashback, gateway, door prize, dan lain sebagainya. Jadi di sini kami melihat antusiasme yang sangat tinggi, bukan saja dari pelaku fintech tersebut, tapi juga dari masyarakat dan juga termasuk dari regulator dan pemerintah. Tren peningkatan ekonomi dan keuangan digital terus berlanjut secara global, termasuk di Indonesia. Dalam kondisi pandemi saat ini, aktivitas EKD terus meningkat, sejalan dengan kesadaran masyarakat dan perubahan perilaku untuk penggunaan e-commerce, seiring adanya pembatasan aktivitas fisik masyarakat. Berbagai data menunjukkan aktivitas EKD terus meningkat, seperti contohnya, nominal transaksi e-commerce pada triwulan 3 2020 tercatat sebesar 70 triliun, atau naik dibandingkan dengan triwulan 2019 yang sekitar 60 triliun. Peningkatan transaksi e-commerce tersebut juga diikuti dengan transformasi pembayaran dari menggunakan transfer bank ke alat pembayaran lainnya, termasuk penggunaan uang elektronik atau UE. Per triwulan 3 2020, pembayaran e-commerce menggunakan UE sudah mencapai 42% dari total pembayaran atau jauh meningkat dibandingkan dengan tahun 2017 yang baru mencapai 11%. Dengan tren digitalisasi yang berlanjut, maka transformasi penggunaan alat pembayaran diperkirakan juga akan berlanjut, termasuk untuk penggunaan UE. Bapak dan Ibu serta hadirin yang kami hormati, Bank Indonesia melihat peran penting teknologi saat ini dan ke depan yang akan mentransformasi pola kebiasaan masyarakat di berbagai aspek kehidupan, termasuk di bidang pembayaran dan ekonomi keuangan. Oleh karena itu, kami menyadari bahwa otoritas harus mampu striking the right balance antara upaya mendorong berkembangnya inovasi dan upaya memitigasi risiko. Sebagai respon terhadap hal tersebut, Bank Indonesia telah menyusun Blueprint Sistem Pembayaran Indonesia atau BSPI 2025. Melalui BSPI 2025, Bank Indonesia berkomitmen penuh untuk mengembangkan ekonomi keuangan digital sistem pembayaran, dan inklusi keuangan yang bertujuan untuk mendorong tercapainya efisiensi transaksi, mempercepat inklusi keuangan, serta memajukan UMKM. Dalam mendukung BSPI 2025 tersebut, maka perlu adanya sinergi dan kerjasama berbagai pihak, tidak hanya dengan pelaku PJSP, tapi juga termasuk dengan perbankan, fintech, e-commerce, otoritas lainnya, dan juga pemerintah, dan pihak lainnya yang masuk dalam ekosistem ekonomi dan keuangan digital. Sinergi tersebut diharapkan akan menciptakan ekosistem yang mendorong customer experience yang lebih baik dan mampu mengisi gap antara layanan yang diberikan oleh lembaga keuangan dengan kebutuhan pelanggan. Salah satunya adalah mendorong standarisasi Open API untuk mengatasi kendala dalam kolaborasi antara bank dan fintech, serta menumbuhkan lebih banyak inovasi yang akan diciptakan dengan juga tetap mengedepankan aspek governance dan keamanan. Bapak Ibu sekalian, kami melihat penyelenggaraan Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020 dan Indonesia Fintech Summit 2020 secara bersama antara otoritas dan industri fintech di Indonesia memberikan manfaat yang besar bagi otoritas, industri, dan seluruh pelaku ekonomi serta masyarakat untuk meningkatkan dukungan fintech bagi percepatan digitalisasi ekonomi dan keuangan. Kami berharap kegiatan ini dapat terus dilanjutkan dan kami, Bank Indonesia, siap untuk terus melanjutkan kolaborasi dengan pemerintah, dengan otoritas jasa keuangan, dengan industri dalam rangka meningkatkan dukungan terhadap ekonomi dan keuangan digital, khususnya untuk mendorong pemulihan ekonomi nasional. Demikian apresiasi dan harapan kami. Terima kasih untuk perhatiannya. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih atas paparan yang sangat luar biasa kepada Ibu Destri Damayanti. Bapak dan Ibu yang kami hormati, sampailah kita pada sambutan yang kita tunggu bersama, yakni keynote speech oleh Wakil Presiden Republik Indonesia, Bapak Kiai Haji Ma'ruf Amin. Yang terhormat Bapak Kiai Haji Ma'ruf Amin, kami silahkan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Yang saya hormati Gubernur Bank Indonesia, Ketua Otoritas Jasa Keuangan, Menteri Komunikasi dan Informatika, para undangan dan hadirin yang berbahagia. Pertama-tama marilah kita panjatkan puji syukur kehadirat Allah Subhanahu wa taala, Tuhan yang Maha Esa, atas segala limpahan berkah, rahmat dan kurnia-Nya kepada kita sekalian, sehingga kita dapat hadir pada acara penutupan Pekan Fintech Nasional tahun 2020 yang bertema mempercepat pemulihan ekonomi nasional melalui upaya bersama digitalisasi jasa keuangan Indonesia. Saya mengucapkan terima kasih atas undangan dan kesempatan yang diberikan kepada saya untuk menyampaikan sambutan kunci pada acara yang sangat penting ini. Apresiasi yang tinggi saya sampaikan pada Bank Indonesia, Otoritas Jasa Keuangan, Asosiasi Fintech Indonesia (AFTEK), dan Asosiasi Fintech Syariah Indonesia (AFSI) atas inisiatif menyelenggarakan Indonesia Fintech Summit 2020 dan Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020. Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020 diselenggarakan dalam situasi pandemi COVID-19 ketika seluruh aspek kehidupan terdampak. Pandemi menunjukkan betapa tergantungnya kita terhadap teknologi digital dalam menjalankan aktivitas selama pandemi. Kita masih tetap dapat melanjutkan aktivitas pemerintahan, pendidikan, dan komunikasi sosial selama pandemi dengan memanfaatkan teknologi digital tersebut. Dalam bidang ekonomi, meskipun terdampak sangat parah, tapi kegiatan ekonomi tetap dapat berjalan berkat bantuan teknologi. Hasil survei Bank Dunia menunjukkan bahwa kegiatan ekonomi yang memanfaatkan teknologi digital atau melakukan aktivitas pemasaran secara online mengalami penurunan lebih kecil dibanding dengan mereka yang tidak melakukan pemasaran secara online. Kondisi di atas makin menunjukkan pentingnya peran teknologi keuangan atau fintech dalam perekonomian. Karena itu, bagi pemerintah, dukungan terhadap pengembangan fintech menjadi prioritas utama saat ini maupun pasca pandemi COVID-19 nanti. Dalam kesempatan ini, saya diminta untuk menyampaikan sambutan kunci dengan topik inovasi fintech syariah dalam mendukung pemulihan ekonomi nasional. Tetapi selain mendiskusikan topik tersebut, saya juga ingin menyampaikan pandangan saya terkait pengembangan fintech secara keseluruhan. Karena ini merupakan kesempatan yang baik dan mengingat pentingnya forum ini. Menurut saya, inovasi fintech syariah sangat penting karena menyangkut pemanfaatan fintech dalam aktivitas ekonomi dan keuangan syariah nasional. Dengan potensi pengembangan ekonomi dan keuangan syariah yang demikian besar, maka diperlukan sarana teknologi keuangan serta proses digitalisasi transaksi yang sesuai dengan prinsip-prinsip syariah. Saya gembira karena hal ini telah direspon dengan baik oleh para pelaku fintech. Berbagai layanan fintech syariah juga telah tersedia, baik itu pembayaran, pinjaman, maupun investasi yang berbasis syariah. Layanan ini selain juga mengikuti prinsip syariah, juga cukup kompetitif. Layanan pembayaran yang disediakan fintech syariah juga termasuk layanan dalam penyaluran zakat, wakaf, infak, dan sedekah. Dalam bentuk yang lain, beberapa pelaku penyedia penjualan online juga membantu menyediakan fitur syariah untuk membantu masyarakat mencari produk-produk halal secara lebih mudah. Selain itu, para pelaku fintech juga telah secara aktif terlibat dalam beberapa inisiatif, termasuk dalam membantu pengembangan UMK berbasis syariah dalam perluasan akses pasar serta pengembangan kapasitas transaksi. Apa yang ditunjukkan oleh pelaku fintech tersebut dengan perkembangan dan inovasi produknya menjadi pendorong terhadap pengembangan ekonomi dan keuangan syariah sebagai salah satu pilar perekonomian nasional. Melalui pemanfaatan fintech akan mendorong semakin banyak masyarakat terlibat dalam aktivitas ekonomi yang dapat mempercepat pemulihan ekonomi nasional. Hadirin yang saya hormati, saya mencermati perkembangan industri teknologi keuangan Indonesia dengan seksama dan saya sangat gembira karena perkembangannya sangat pesat dalam 4 tahun terakhir. Penyelenggaraan fintech yang berbadan hukum di Indonesia mencapai hampir 500 penyelenggara fintech dalam berbagai bentuk dan layanan. Perkembangan ini tentunya sangat signifikan karena pada tahun 2016 hanya sekitar 24 penyelenggara fintech berbadan hukum yang terdaftar. Perkembangan pesat dari industri teknologi keuangan juga ditandai dengan semakin bervariasinya model bisnis dan solusi teknologi keuangan. Saya mencatat setidaknya terdapat lebih dari 23 model bisnis yang tersedia, termasuk dalam bentuk layanan pembayaran digital, digital payment, layanan pinjaman digital, digital lending, layanan pengumpulan dana secara digital, digital capital raising, yang salah satu bentuk populernya adalah crowdfunding, layanan asuransi berbasis teknologi insurtech, layanan manajemen investasi berbasis teknologi wealthtech, serta layanan pengumpulan informasi pasar, market, provisioning. Dengan berkembangnya model bisnis dan solusi teknologi keuangan tersebut, membuat masyarakat memiliki banyak pilihan dalam melakukan aktivitas ekonomi. Sebagai contoh, berkat layanan pembayaran digital, kita dapat melakukan transaksi pembayaran tagihan seperti pembayaran premi BPJS Kesehatan ataupun rekening listrik dengan sangat mudah melalui platform pembayaran digital. Melakukan transaksi apapun sekarang hanya berjarak satu sentuhan jari atau one touch away berkat kehadiran teknologi keuangan digital ini. Model bisnis digital, lending maupun peer-to-peer P2P, lending mampu menjadi alternatif bagi masyarakat dan UMKM untuk mendapatkan dana. Dua model bisnis fintech lending ini dapat menjadi solusi praktis bagi UMK yang membutuhkan modal usaha dengan cara yang relatif mudah dan praktis. Tanpa teknologi seperti ini, kita tidak dapat membayangkan bahwa pinjaman modal dapat diperoleh hanya dengan menggunakan smartphone atau tablet. Model bisnis lainnya seperti layanan asuransi juga demikian. Membeli asuransi menjadi semudah berbelanja online. Model bisnis layanan manajemen investasi juga demikian. Sebagai contoh, kita bisa melakukan transaksi pembelian emas dengan harga pasar hanya melalui smartphone dan tanpa perlu menyimpan fisik emas tersebut. Berkat berbagai inovasi dan model bisnis tersebut, adopsi fintech dalam masyarakat juga berkembang pesat yang ditandai oleh beberapa indikator. Salah satunya adalah jumlah e-money. Sebagai contoh, jumlah e-money di Indonesia pada bulan September 2020 bertumbuh 68% dibandingkan pada periode yang sama tahun 2019 dengan total jumlah transaksi mencapai 144 triliun. Hal ini menunjukkan peningkatan yang pesat dalam pemanfaatan fintech pembayaran. Padahal kita semua sedang menghadapi situasi krisis akibat pandemi COVID-19. Yang menarik, pada bulan April 2020 ketika pemberlakuan pembatasan sosial berskala besar PSBB tahap pertama, ketika masyarakat sebagian besar tinggal di rumah, nilai transaksi uang elektronik justru menunjukkan angka tertinggi senilai 17,55 triliun. Fakta ini menunjukkan bahwa fintech pembayaran mampu membantu masyarakat serta UMK dalam bertransaksi di tengah penerapan PSBB tersebut. Selain itu, akumulasi pembagian pinjaman yang dilayani oleh penyedia fintech lending pada bulan September 2020 juga telah mencapai 128,7 triliun yang disalurkan kepada lebih dari 29 juta akun peminjam. Hal ini juga secara tidak langsung dapat menunjukkan bahwa layanan pinjaman melalui fintech lending dapat membantu menyediakan likuiditas bagi masyarakat dan juga UMK selama pandemi COVID-19. Perkembangan menarik juga dapat kita lihat dari sisi tersedianya akses jasa keuangan bagi masyarakat. Sejauh ini terdapat lebih dari 5 juta agen fintech yang menyediakan akses pada jasa keuangan yang tersebar di berbagai wilayah Indonesia, sehingga semakin mendorong inklusi masyarakat terhadap layanan keuangan. Hal ini tentu sangat berperan positif dalam mendorong perkembangan ekonomi masyarakat yang pada gilirannya turut memperkuat ekonomi nasional. Atas semua perkembangan yang menggembirakan tersebut, saya ingin memberikan apresiasi kepada seluruh pelaku industri fintech nasional. Saya juga memberikan apresiasi dan penghargaan yang tinggi bagi Bank Indonesia dan OJK yang telah mampu mendorong perkembangan fintech di tanah air dengan sangat baik. Saya melihat dan menyaksikan kerja keras Bank Indonesia dan OJK selama ini. Oleh karena itu, atas nama pemerintah, saya mengucapkan terima kasih yang sebesar-besarnya. Hadirin yang saya hormati, perkembangan industri fintech tanah air yang pesat tersebut tentunya sangat menggembirakan. Namun setiap perkembangan selalu datang dengan konsekuensi, karena layanan teknologi keuangan ini melibatkan dana masyarakat, serta memberikan layanan keuangan kepada masyarakat, maka terdapat risiko yang harus dimitigasi. Perlindungan terhadap kepentingan masyarakat harus menjadi prioritas utama. Karena itu, pelaku fintech juga harus memperkuat tata kelola penyelenggaraan layanan. Aspek keamanan teknologi perlu terus disempurnakan. Selain itu, edukasi pemanfaatan layanan secara prudent dan rasional kepada masyarakat juga harus dilakukan. Saya ingin mengingatkan bahwa layanan fintech sama seperti layanan keuangan lainnya merupakan bisnis yang berbasis kepercayaan. Karena itu, menjaga kepercayaan masyarakat merupakan hal yang tidak bisa ditawar. Dalam memitigasi risiko, peran regulator juga tentu sangat penting. Karena itu saya mengharapkan agar Bank Indonesia dan otoritas jasa keuangan dapat menjalankan perannya secara optimal untuk memastikan penyelenggaraan layanan teknologi keuangan ini berjalan dengan baik. Meskipun demikian, saya juga mengharapkan agar BI dan OJK juga tetap adaptif dan proaktif terhadap perkembangan teknologi seperti yang selama ini telah ditunjukkan. Jangan sampai teknologi yang berkembang pesat tidak disertai dengan penyediaan regulasi yang memadai. Regulasi harus mampu menjadi katalisator terhadap berkembangnya teknologi dan tidak seharusnya menjadi penghambat perkembangannya. Hadirin yang saya hormati, salah satu peran penting layanan teknologi keuangan adalah membantu pemerintah dalam menyediakan teknologi untuk penyaluran bantuan dan subsidi pemerintah kepada masyarakat, khususnya masyarakat miskin dan rentan. Hal ini sangat penting untuk memastikan kesuksesan penyaluran bantuan dan subsidi pemerintah untuk membantu masyarakat miskin dan rentan. Saya gembira karena salah satu hasil penting dalam penyelenggaraan Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020 ini adalah peluncuran rekomendasi kebijakan yang disiapkan bersama oleh Tim Nasional Percepatan Penanggulangan Kemiskinan TNP 2K bersama dengan Asosiasi Fintech Indonesia (AFTEK) yang merekomendasikan pemanfaatan fintech dengan autentifikasi biometrik wajah sebagai solusi penyaluran bantuan dan subsidi pemerintah. Saya mengharapkan Bank Indonesia dan OJK dapat membantu pemerintah dalam memfasilitasi pemanfaatan teknologi fintech biometrik wajah ini sesuai dengan perannya sebagai regulator. Saya harapkan bantuan pemerintah tetap disalurkan melalui rekening bank penerima manfaat, tapi proses transaksi di merchant atau toko dilakukan menggunakan aplikasi fintech dengan autentifikasi biometrik wajah. Hadirin yang saya hormati, layanan teknologi fintech atau fintech merupakan hasil dari inovasi pemanfaatan teknologi digital. Inovasi dan teknologi merupakan dua kekuatan utama dalam memenangkan persaingan. Karena itu, kita semua harus secara serius mendukung pengembangan fintech ini, bukan hanya untuk fintech itu sendiri, juga bukan hanya untuk memperkuat layanan keuangan, tapi lebih dari itu sebagai sarana untuk mendukung pertumbuhan ekonomi nasional. Pemanfaatan fintech dapat mendorong pertumbuhan UMK, juga mendorong pertumbuhan industri ekonomi kreatif, pariwisata, dan jasa lainnya. Dengan demikian, fintech berperan penting dalam upaya pemulihan ekonomi nasional akibat pandemi COVID-19 serta mendukung pertumbuhan ekonomi setelahnya. Kita juga melihat dan mengapresiasi inisiatif Bank Indonesia dalam melakukan transformasi digital pada sistem pembayaran sesuai dengan blueprint sistem pembayaran Indonesia 2025. Digitalis sistem pembayaran ini berperan sangat penting dan strategis untuk mendukung transformasi digital ekonomi dan keuangan Indonesia sebagai bagian dari kebijakan reformasi struktural untuk pertumbuhan ekonomi yang tinggi, inklusif, dan berkelanjutan. Saat ini diperkirakan masih terdapat sekitar 91,3 juta penduduk dan 62,9 juta UMKM yang belum atau masih sedikit memanfaatkan layanan keuangan. Melalui berbagai inisiatif tersebut, kita melihat besarnya potensi sistem pembayaran digital modern untuk membawa kelompok masyarakat dan usaha tersebut terhubung dengan bank dan fintech, sehingga dapat memperoleh berbagai layanan keuangan yang bermanfaat seperti tabungan, kredit, investasi, dan asuransi. Khusus untuk pengembangan ekonomi dan keuangan syariah, peran fintech juga merupakan bagian yang tidak terpisahkan. Untuk pelaku usaha mikro dan kecil syariah, misalnya, fintech dapat mendukung penguatan peran institusi keuangan mikro syariah. Selain itu, fintech juga dapat mendorong penciptaan usaha-usaha syariah baru. Dalam skala yang lebih luas, pemanfaatan fintech bagi pelaku usaha syariah, skala mikro dan skala kecil, dapat mendorong mereka agar bagian dari rantai nilai industri halal global untuk memacu pertumbuhan usaha dan peningkatan ketahanan ekonomi umat. Bagi masyarakat, pemanfaatan fintech memudahkan masyarakat untuk terlibat dalam berbagai kegiatan ekonomi, baik itu transaksi, investasi, maupun layanan keuangan lainnya. Semakin banyak keterlibatan masyarakat dalam kegiatan ekonomi secara langsung, berdampak pada perbaikan ekonomi dan membantu mempercepat pemulihan ekonomi nasional. Menutup sambutan ini, saya ingin mengingatkan kita semua untuk senantiasa mematuhi protokol pencegahan COVID-19. Pandemi ini masih jauh dari selesai. Karena itu pastikan kita selalu menggunakan masker, menjaga jarak, dan rajin mencuci tangan untuk memutus penyebaran COVID-19. Hanya dengan itu kita dapat mempercepat upaya untuk keluar dari krisis yang kita hadapi saat ini. Di akhir sambutan ini, saya mengucapkan selamat pada Gubernur Bank Indonesia, Ketua Dewan Komisioner Otoritas Jasa Keuangan, Pimpinan Asosiasi Fintech Indonesia, Pimpinan Asosiasi Fintech Syariah Indonesia, Pimpinan dan Manajemen Perusahaan Penyedia Layanan Fintech, serta seluruh pihak yang terlibat dalam penyelenggaraan Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020 ini. Acara ini telah berlangsung dengan sukses dan memberikan kontribusi nyata bagi pengembangan teknologi keuangan di tanah air. Saya mendoakan semoga Allah Subhanahu wa taala senantiasa meridai setiap ikhtiar yang telah dan sedang akan kita lakukan. Sekian, terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Ya, terima kasih kepada Bapak Kiai Haji Ma'ruf Amin atas sambutannya yang sangat inspiratif. Ladies and gentlemen, we will go to the highlighter speech with the topic The Future of Digital Financial Services in ASEAN Investors Perspective. The session will be presented by Managing Director Investment Temasek, Ms. Connie Chen. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Ms. Connie Chen.
Hi, good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for having me here to discuss the future of digital financial services in ASEAN from an investor perspective. So at Temasek, we're quite excited about the long-term prospects of digital financial services in the region and have been tracking the market actively for potential investment opportunities. This year is significantly noteworthy as we witness the acceleration in adoption of digital financial services, as well as the overall resilience in the digital economy, despite the significant challenges from the pandemic. For the past 5 years, Temasek has published, along with our co-authors Google and Bain, a report called Southeast Asia E-Economy, which focuses on digital economies in Southeast Asia. So today, I'm happy to share some of the findings from that report, as well as share some of our perspectives as an investor. We move on to the next page. So I'll start by describing some of the factors and trends driving acceleration of digital financial services. Next page. So starting with consumers, COVID-19 has really brought a change in behavior. There was a significant shift away from cash and also increased trust in online transactions. On the business side, the pandemic really somewhat forced merchants as well as SMEs to migrate online, which effectively lowered the barrier to using digital payments. This is something that had existed for a long time. And with that, really creates a virtuous cycle with more merchants and more consumers coming online, creating a better digital footprint on both sides, which will eventually allow better data capture, which enables credit underwriting, as well as expanding into other parts of financial services. I think importantly, regulators have played a very pivotal role in supporting this. They supported the adoption of digital financial services, also encouraged consumers to transact digitally, and many regulators in the region also laid out critical infrastructure to promote the growth of digital financial services, such as eKYC, digital identity, as well as fostering some innovation, for example, with the introduction of digital banking licenses. If we move on to the next page, so you can see that many of the DFS verticals have continued to grow this year despite the challenges coming from the pandemic. And we believe in the long term that digital financial services in Southeast Asia will remain very strong. And I'll share some of the observations that we see in each of these verticals in the following slides. On the next page. So starting with digital payments. So overall gross transaction value shrunk this year due to lockdown restrictions. But if you take a closer look at the differences between pre-COVID and post-COVID, the average number of cash transactions by consumers actually declined. from 48% before COVID to only 37% post-COVID. Another notable trend is the growth in e-wallets. So many of the e-wallet players are seeing strong organic user growth, also very high user engagement. This is aided by more merchants now accepting these digital payments. So as a result, the e-wallets GTV is estimated to increase by more than 100% this year, which will make up around 3% of total C2B payment value from only 1% last year. And obviously with these levels, there's still very much ample room for further growth from here. Moving to the next page. So on cross-border payments, this is another vertical where we see a surge in adoption. So movement restrictions in many countries as a result of the pandemic have resulted in strong adoption of digital remittances. So you can see downloads for key cross-border remittance apps actually increased 30% this year. And many of the employers started paying their workers electronically, also helping them to send money home to their families in digital form. I think given the relative convenience of digital remittance and now the increased trust in these service providers, we think this customer shift from offline to online will be here to stay. On the next page, we take a look at digital lending. Now, digital lending has been set back in the near term by credit quality concerns, also funding constraints. So governments across the region have intervened through loan moratoriums, loan restructurings, or interest rate adjustments. And given the weakened business activity, also reduced income, banks, as well as the investors that were funding the fintech loans, have become extra cautious. But we think that lender confidence will remain weak in the near term due to these asset quality concerns. But however, in the long term, we think this growth prospects will continue to remain strong. I think the current cycle will put many of the credit underwriting models to the test. And those who survive this current crisis, improve the performance of their underwriting models, will come out bigger and stronger. In addition, the data available through payments and other digital activities will further strengthen the industry's ability to price loans by using this richer, non-traditional set of data. Moving to the next page. On to insurance. So digital insurance is expected to see around 30% growth this year, which is partly helped by increased demand for life as well as health policies as consumers become more risk aware and risk conscious. So these products were actually historically very challenging to sell online, but we're seeing this meaningful shift in consumer behavior during the pandemic. In addition, partnership between established insurers as well as consumer platforms have spurred innovative products, such as bite-sized microinsurance, which has higher conversion potential, just given the smaller ticket size, but also the ability to serve and protect the underinsured customer segments. So moving to the next page, I guess the big question is, with all the changes that took place this year, the question will be, is this trend and are these changes to consumer and merchant behavior here to stay? Well, based on a survey that we had commissioned, the answer is yes. 93% of new consumers of digital services responded that they will continue using at least one digital service, even post-COVID. I think another data point that's interesting is comparing the average hours spent online before, during, and after the lockdown. Even though the post-lockdown time spent online is lower than while we were all in lockdown, it's still about 20% higher than pre-lockdown, which indicates that users are much more engaged online even after these lockdown restrictions were removed. Just moving to the next page. So in the next section, I will talk a little bit about how we see the digital financial services landscape evolving with a particular focus on platform players. Move to the next page. So last year, in our Google Temasek Bain report, we had defined consumer digital financial services players into 4 main architects. One of them is pure play fintech companies, as you can see in the top left quadrant. So these are players that are more nimble, early stage companies with a specific sector focus. The second type are established financial services players that you can see in the lower left quadrant. So these are incumbents like banks that provide digital financial services through digitizing traditional offerings. The third type are consumer tech platforms in the upper right-hand corner. So they offer services like e-commerce, ride-hailing, or social media as their core product, but then expanding into digital financial services in order to strengthen the engagement with users, as well as monetize their customer relationships. And then lastly, in the lower right-hand corner, are the traditional consumer-oriented sectors like retail, airlines, telcos. These are all companies that have very large customer bases and are also interested in offering digital financial services to their customer base. We move to the next page. You can see that the space is undoubtedly crowded, right? And we're seeing that the lines are blurring though between the archetypes because there's more and more increasing collaboration and partnership between the different players. For example, consumer tech and established consumer platforms, i.e. the right side of the page, they want to leverage the financial know-how of the incumbents as well as the pure play fintechs to establish financial products and services that are suitable for their customer base. On the other hand, we have pure play fintechs and consumer tech players, i.e. the top of the page, working closely with banks who can provide stable funding, which is critical to scaling any lending business. On the next page, just sharing another trend that we're seeing is that online platforms moving from their core product and services and expanding into digital financial services as they look for other avenues for growth and monetization as part of their path to profitability. So digital financial services, especially digital lending, is now viewed as a critical value driver. For example, companies like Gojek and Grab, who initially started with transportation and moved into food delivery, also view digital financial services as a core focus area. And similarly, e-commerce players like Shopee, Tokopedia, and online travel players like Traveloka also have a strong focus on digital financial services as part of their offerings. In the next page, you can see that in the process of building out a full suite of digital financial services, many of these platform players started with an e-wallet offering, which helped them build up the user base with high transaction frequency. And from there, many of them offer short-term lending products to start with, often tied to purchase scenarios like a pay later product. And these kind of products help to increase the purchasing power of the consumer, increase the success rate of the actual purchase transaction, as well as generate additional revenues. And then relatively speaking, insurance and the investment verticals are less developed compared to payments and lending. Most of the players we see are actually working with product manufacturers to distribute these products as opposed to manufacturing it themselves. This helps them maintain an asset-light model as well as benefiting from the high distribution margins. So as digital financial services can be embedded in the customer's journey while consuming a digital service, we find that pricing may not be always the critical factor. And consumers are actually rather influenced by the transaction scenario in which the digital financial service is being embedded, as well as product suitability for the consumer themselves and how they see the differentiation. If you go to the next page, I'll just summarize in summary what we think that how we think the digital financial services landscape will continue to evolve with the following trends. So first, we do think that consumer tech platforms are very well positioned to gain market share, especially in the key battleground, which is underbanked segment. These consumer tech platforms have access to millions of customers as well as businesses, which will be very challenging for incumbent financial institutions or pure play fintechs to build themselves or match. These consumer tech platforms also have better user engagement and as a result, more and better access to data on their customers. The second observation would be that we think that market share shift will continue to go from the digital laggards to the digital leaders, which will make it very urgent for incumbent players to digitalize their product offerings as well as their product channels. And with the significant increase in adoption of digital services by consumers, especially this year, consumers now have higher expectation as well of their digital experience. The third point would be that, the role of balance sheet, strong balance sheet as well as funding stability will remain very important in terms of scaling and the sustainability of any digital lending business. And then lastly, partnerships. Partnerships with players that can fill the gap in capabilities will be increasingly important. We're seeing more and more banks, for example, keen to work with consumer players to get access to consumers that they could otherwise not reach. And then likewise, we're also seeing consumer players very interested to work with banks as funding partners and also as providers of underwriting capability. Move on to the next page. So in the next section, we'll speak a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing in terms of equity fundraising in the digital economy players. Starting with the next page. So you can see on the chart on the left-hand side, investments in Southeast Asia digital economy companies continue to flourish. The number of transactions increased by 17% year on year between first half 19 and first half 20. And the chart on the right shows the same data for Indonesia alone, which also shows very robust investment activities. We move on to the next page. We're just zooming in on equity fundraising in the Southeast Asia fintech sector. The story really remains the same. So deal value surged to a record high of 1.7 billion US in 2019, which is a 40% jump from 2018 levels. More investment and consolidations are expected to happen in the coming years as financial as well as strategic investors capitalize on the fast-growing digital financial service sector. On the next page, just some observations about what we see in the market from investor perspective. We do think that going forward, we'll expect probably more caution on the part of investors with a recalibration towards sustainable and profitable growth. So investors will refocus on positive unit economics as well as path to profitability versus only focusing on GTV or user growth. But having said that, we also observed that dry powder reached record highs in 2019, with investors holding on to substantial capital going into 2020. I guess, obviously, in this current climate, different investors will have various investment strategies. We'll continue to see the strong leading companies be able to get funding at premium valuations. Lastly, on the valuation front, we do expect a continuation of divergence, with premiums paid for those companies, the leaders, with sizable customer reach, sustainable growth, as well as a path to profitability. And then on the next page, this is the last page, really, where I'll just sum it up in terms of our observations of the sector. Again, first of all, we're very excited about the long-term prospects of digital financial services in Southeast Asia. I think the region's uniqueness comes from the large underbanked and unbanked population that are yet digitally savvy. And they make up nearly 50% of the overall population, or 200 million people in total. And as a long-term investor, Temasek is very much focused on secular trends as opposed to just cyclical drivers. And yes, the pandemic have affected near-term macroeconomic situation and also near-term growth of certain verticals in digital financial services. But at the same time, it has accelerated the penetration and adoption of digital financial services across all countries. And we think that this secular shift is here to stay. We also see that the SME merchant segment as a relatively untapped segment, and companies will probably focus more on this going forward due to better unit economics compared to the consumer side in most cases. Another observation is just across all digital financial services verticals, lending is the largest revenue pool and competition there is intense. In the current pandemic, we do notice a shift in terms of focus from volume growth to actually better risk management and funding stability. I think the current cycle that we're facing today will provide an opportunity to differentiate good underwriting models and really putting them to the test during this cycle. Third is, I guess, among the various ingredients to success, we think that scaling requires access to a large customer base, whether it's through your own customer base or through partnerships. Equally important is execution. So platform players, as we talked about, have an inherent advantage with regards to large customer base. But we're also seeing varying degrees of success, which shows the importance of focus, strategy, and execution. And lastly, continued regulatory support in terms of promoting innovation and infrastructure investment will be very critical to the growth of digital financial services. Equally important is the financial inclusion agenda, especially for the unbanked and rural customers. And this will also require policy support as well as incentives to really unlock the full potential of this segment. So in summary, we see a very promising future for digital financial services in Southeast Asia. We're very excited to be part of this journey as active investors in the region. And this concludes our thoughts on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Ms. Connie Chen for the amazing speech and presentation today. And we will now continue with In the Limelight session with the topic, the role of innovative financial inclusion in post-pandemic economic recovery. By Vice President Operations 2 ADB, please welcome Mr. Ahmed M. Said.
Thank you. Good morning. Selamat pagi. Before anything, I wanted to begin with a word of congratulations and wanted to extend my very sincere congratulations to AFTEC, OJK, BEI, and all the Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020 supporters, as well as, I think, even more importantly, to participants in this very, very important and very successful and productive 2-week-long FinTech Summit. I wanted to begin just by saying a word about the relationship between innovation and development progress. Because innovation and the work of this summit really lies at the heart of making development progress. We speak often about gains in income, gains in GDP, and of course we understand development to be a much broader process than growth in income. But focusing just on income for a moment, income gains come from productivity gains, and productivity gains come from innovation. And so the work of innovation is the work of development. The work of innovation is the work of improving the quality of human life. But I would say even more important, or at least equally important to the task of innovating, is the task of disseminating innovation and promoting the adoption and sharing of new ideas, new products, new ways of doing things. Forums such as this are absolutely critical to that dissemination process through the means through which ideas percolate through an economy and ultimately affect the lives of all within it. And so I want to commend the organizers and those participating for engaging in work over the course of the last week that is critically important, and I also believe very, very noble. What I was hoping to do today to talk about here as we reach the closing of the summit is to just touch on three subjects. The first is the impact of COVID-19. The second is the importance of financial inclusion and digitalization, particularly in light of COVID-19. And the third is the role of the Asian Development Bank and other institutions like it. So let me begin with the current context and the current pandemic, which is really the single greatest challenge we will all be confronting over the course of the next year, and I think as we seek to recover from it in the years after that. Now, this new global pandemic is something really that none of us have seen before, and as a consequence of that, there is much that we don't know. We don't know even today, almost 1 year into this, how long it will overtake to overcome the pandemic. What will be its impact, medium term, longer term, on Indonesia, on the region, on the global economy? We don't yet know clearly its impact on people, on their healths, on their livelihoods, on their behaviors. And indeed, we do not yet know its impact on the financial sector and on financial services, including on issues like financial inclusion, as well as on the viability and health of financial sector balance sheets. What we do know is that this pandemic is having an enormous immediate economic and health consequence. Indonesia, a country that entered this crisis on very, very healthy macroeconomic footing, has experienced significant GDP contractions in recent quarters and is expecting the first recession in many years in 2020. I would emphasize, not just do we see this reduction in top line numbers, but very, very importantly, the human cost of this is disproportionately borne by the poorest. Poverty is increasing, inequality is increasing, unemployment is increasing. The sectors that employ great numbers of people, transportation, hospitality, hotels, restaurants, these sectors are disproportionately affected. The sectors that consist of thousands of micro and small businesses, businesses owned by men and women who not only provide essential services, but also struggle to support families and livelihoods. These segments of the economy are the most affected. And so as we begin our conversation, or I should say close our conversation at the end of these 2 weeks on fintech and on financial inclusion, I think it's so important for us to remember the backdrop and the backdrop of this extraordinary crisis. As we move forward, it is very, very clear that financial inclusion will become even more important than it was before. In part, this is because there is the risk and the reality of ground lost in development progress. Indonesia is a country that in fact made great progress in financial inclusion. In 2018, some 56% of the adult population owned a bank account. This number had risen 20% over the course of only a year to 76% in 2019. It'll be critical to make sure that these gains are not lost, but that they're actually built upon. And not only has COVID-19 made financial inclusion more important, but it has also accelerated some of the underlying drivers of financial inclusion. Certainly, we are all aware, this forum, its online nature makes clear that we are in a more digitized world than we were even just a year ago. We understand, for example, from the Coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs that in Indonesia, more than 300,000 SMEs have digitized operations in response to COVID-19. This response, of course, I think we all recognize and know, in many cases was critical to their financial and economic survival. And the government here, of course, has been making efforts for some time to digitize social assistance programs as well, beginning in 2017 in order to improve delivery efficiency. This was a very critical set of initiatives that allowed the government to respond more effectively to the pandemic. And these initiatives bode well for the future effectiveness of the government's National Economic Recovery Program. I would also note that the numbers I cited and the significant improvement in financial inclusion is a reflection of the government's support for the rapid digitization of financial services. This includes a focus on fintech adoption, on efforts to promote financial inclusion through innovative approaches and to accelerate the economic recovery process. For example, eKYC is a tool that has facilitated onboarding of large numbers of previously unbanked people into the formal financial system. These digital-based financial services have offered lower cost, ease of use, and faster services. And financial technology can be used not only to increase access for underserved populations, but also as a means to provide digital financial education and to increase financial consumer protection. Access to finance, along with financial literacy and consumer protection, are key to responsible financial and digital financial inclusion. This, in turn, enables the use of various financial services by the underserved and opens up opportunities for them to achieve their full potential and for the country to be on a path towards economic recovery. Now, in light of the importance of these subjects, I wanted to highlight some of the ways that we as an institution are engaged and help. I would say in the first instance that we begin with a deep recognition of the enormous importance of pushing for more digital technology-driven development and innovation in Southeast Asia as a means to addressing both long-term development challenges as well as more pressing near-term needs brought to the fore by the pandemic. And we will be working with Indonesia and other countries across the region to find ways to address regional disparities and to ensure more equitable access to technology. As many of you will be aware, the ADB has a long partnership with the government of Indonesia and OJK in supporting financial inclusion for development. Our shared vision includes increasing access for underserved population segments to financial services through financial sector innovations such as Fintech. We also share the view that enhanced financial and digital financial literacy and financial consumer protection are critical ingredients to responsible financial and digital financial inclusion. In this context, we are very pleased to see the solid progress that the government of Indonesia has made towards its financial goals, despite or indeed because of the challenging times. The progress was also due in part to close collaboration with the private sector, including AFTEC. And we're proud of our own affiliation with these efforts and their early successes. We will, of course, be making efforts to build on these. And I'm very pleased to share with you that we'll soon be taking to our board for approval the Promoting Innovative Financial Inclusion Program, an initiative that is dedicated to financial inclusion in partnership with the government and facilitated through the Asian Development Bank. This program aims to support policy and technology enablers to foster innovations to accelerate and enhance financial inclusion. It will support tools and infrastructure for financial inclusion and seeks to increase access to finance for MSMEs, as well as for marginalized groups, including women and the young. The program will strengthen the regulatory framework for digital financial services, data privacy, consumer protection, and financial and digital financial literacy. I'd like to share 3 messages on the role of financial inclusion in Fintech for Indonesia's economic recovery. And I wanted also to provide some examples of ADB's initiatives in these areas. First, we can help Indonesia establish a robust regulatory environment and strengthen institutional capacity to promote digital financial innovations. Regulators would need to both foster technological innovations as well as ensure responsible industry conduct. ADB has been privileged to provide extensive support to OJK's Digital Finance Innovation Group in our role as industry accelerator, incubator, and regulator, or in their role, I should say, as industry accelerator, incubator, and regulator of the fintech sector. In line with the Digital Finance Innovation Roadmap and Action Plan 2020 to 2025, ADB has provided assistance in the regulatory sandbox, digital finance regulations, RegTech, and supervisory technology frameworks. In addition, ADB has provided knowledge support on accelerating financial inclusion in Southeast Asia through digital finance. Second, we can promote collaboration with the fintech sector as a means of expanding financial services to MSMEs and the underserved, such as women and youth. Leveraging on fintech, there is a significant opportunity to incubate and develop MSMEs, recover in the short term, and become more efficient in the medium to long term. Together with OJK, ADB is supporting the Eastern Indonesia Financial Innovation Lab. This initiative supports regional development banks to use innovative technology solutions in partner with the fintech sector to expand financial services to medium and small to medium-sized enterprises, micro to small and medium-sized enterprises in Eastern Indonesia. ADB also supported the recently launched Lokar Siku, a geospatial financial services mobile platform by OJK, which enables one to locate branchless banking agents and other financial services, thus facilitating financial inclusion. Together with MasterCard, we are also working to leverage private sector partnerships to support Indonesia through a pilot program in Bandung that connects Warung, 70% of which are owned by women, with distributors and consumer-packed goods companies using a fintech platform. ADB's private sector operations will expand its microfinance risk participation and guarantee program to include more Indonesian microfinance institutions. In addition, through ADB Ventures, a new venture platform that will support and invest in startups offering impact technology solutions, we are investing in fintech companies that are providing services such as credit scoring, KYC, payment, and collection to online lenders of MSMEs. Third, we can support promoting both financial literacy and digital financial literacy in Indonesia. We have been working extensively with OJK to produce financial literacy and digital financial education and consumer protection materials. ADB supported Indonesia's participation in the PISA, including on financial literacy. The PISA is the Program for International Student Assessment. It further supported OJK to develop and launch e-modules-based financial literacy materials for elementary and high school students. More recently, ADB supported OJK's financial literacy materials for early childhood and digital financial literacy materials as part of Smart Digital Indonesia. ADB's interventions in this area also include innovative programs such as YBank, which piloted in 2019 as an experiential financial education and career exploration program for Indonesian youth. I wanted to conclude by noting again that COVID-19 has forced us to confront some enormous and significant challenges to development progress and to improving the livelihoods of those most in need. However, I believe firmly that economic recovery and financial inclusion must move hand in hand, and that achieving these goals will require the collaboration of the private sector, of industry players, of fintech providers, and regulators such as OJK and BEI, as well as the government through instruments such as the Ministry of Communication and Information Technology. We at the Asian Development Bank will do our part in coordination and collaboration with other development partners to support these efforts. We look forward to continued success. Let me conclude by offering my congratulations once again to Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020 organizers and all of those who've made and played a role in making this such a successful, important, and memorable event. Thank you so much for providing me the opportunity to share the perspective of the Asian Development Bank, and we very much look forward to future collaboration with this forum.
Thank you very much to Mr. Ahmed M. Said for enlightening us with your presentation today. Ladies and gentlemen, we will continue with the highlighter station industry on the topic of margin call, investors' view on Indonesia FinTech. And this session will be moderated by the President of Jakarta Foreign Correspondents Club JFCC and Southeast Asian News Editor Reuters, Mr. Edward Davis. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Edward Davis.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. In my 2 stints in Indonesia, I've seen interest in fintech and the digital economy explode, with huge demand from our readers for coverage of startups and investment in tech in general. And the pandemic has surely accelerated many of these trends. Of course, there are risks from greater financial inclusion without the right balance of regulation and digital literacy. But I'd like to welcome our panelists today for this session, who are all leading lights in the investor scene. Peter Kemp is principal of Sequoia Capital, based in Singapore, and one of the first members of its Southeast Asia investment team. He advises on early stage investments in consumer internet and fintech, and serves on the board of more than 10 companies. He previously ran his own startup and worked at an incubator and held various roles at Cisco and Amazon, targeting ecosystems across Asia. The second person on the panel is William Ghazali, who is Vice Chairman of the Indonesia Venture Capital Association and CEO of BRI Ventures, a $250 million fund backed by Bank BRI, investing in Southeast Asia's best companies. He previously led the investment division of Indonesia's biggest telco, CVC, where he invested in startups globally. As he notes, working together with Indonesia's largest telco and largest bank has given him deep knowledge and understanding of how to crack the Indonesian market. And our third member of the panel is Andy Devishi, who leads the IFC's Fintech Investment Group. An entrepreneur at heart, he loves helping management build companies as an equity investor. He started investing in his native Albania in financial services, real estate, retail, and manufacturing. While with IFC, he has been investing around the world in over 20 countries, and for the past 10 years, he and his team have focused exclusively on fintech, helping IFC build the largest such dedicated portfolio in emerging markets. So I'd like to open up to the panel. I mean, as investors, I'd like to start the discussion perhaps to get a sense of how each of you see the current digital economy landscape in Indonesia, and also how you see the fintech growth in Indonesia, and if possible, how does that compare to what's going on in other countries in Southeast Asia? Perhaps I could start with William as the local person here. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Edward and the fellow panelists. So I think, yeah, this is an interesting time if talking about the current digital landscape of Indonesia, because we're pretty bullish as an investors, because if we recall, like the tech startup movement in Indonesia, all the unicorns were born in around 2009, 2010. So it's barely 10 years. So we are still in growth phases. You know, the early days, like all the unicorns and the Android mobile adoptions, it starts like around a decade ago. So the subset and continuations of digital economy are still growing. I would say like pioneered by the Iron Triangle, I would say. The Iron Triangle consists of the e-commerce, fintech, and logistics. Those are the sectors that really drive our digital economy forward. And after 10 years, we're seeing that we're entering the subset of this industry. The subsectors are growing. So we're pretty much on the second wave, on the second decade, and we're still in a growth phase, and the opportunity is still tremendous.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps I could get Peter's thoughts on that.
Sorry for that. I think if you think about the current landscape, I think we've obviously seen a lot of growth. And if you look at all the reports out there, it shows that Indonesia is consistently one of the fastest growers, whether it is in lending or remittances or insurance or investment products. So I think that is a positive. But despite that, obviously there are certain parts of the ecosystem that are still early. The market and landscape is still very much undigitized, with few people that are banked, that have credit cards, etc. And I think globally, Indonesia is the second largest cash economy, right? And so that tells you something about what's not great yet, but it also tells you how big the opportunity is. And so from that point of view, we're seeing a lot of startups, within the Sequoia Capital portfolio as well as outside of our portfolio, that are seeing these opportunities and are addressing that. And I'm sure we'll talk more about opportunities that we're seeing. But thanks to an increase in digitization, an increase in regulation, an increase in smartphone penetration, etc., I think the landscape is changing quite rapidly. And look forward to zoom into some of the aspects later on in this conversation.
Thank you. Perhaps Andy, from your perspective. You're on mute. Still on mute, I think.
sorry. A digital economy, we're talking about developing a digital economy, a digital ecosystem, and that is as good as the ability of each member of the ecosystem to transact and to cooperate digitally. So from that perspective, Indonesia has a way to go. Every individual has to be more digitally enabled and more digitally willing. Every small business needs to be digitally enabled. Every big business needs to be digitally enabled and transact digitally. The government has to be digitally enabled, etc. So there's many vectors that will make this happen. And I will agree completely with Peter that I see that as a huge opportunity in all aspects, from all sides of the participants, that every single one of them has to move up that trajectory. And if you add all those trajectories together, it creates a massive, massive opportunity for Indonesia as a whole.
Thank you. And just a follow-up question from me. Do we think there's going to be a lot more consolidation in the market in 2021? I mean, given the pressures from the pandemic, and I think Reuters has reported on talks between OVO and Dana, for instance. Are you expecting there to be a lot of activity coming out of the pandemic, hopefully? Perhaps I could ask William on that one.
Yeah, so I think it's yes and no, because I think the consolidations, of course, they need to consider about the potential synergies and the potential efficiencies. So I think I would expect there will be an increase for next year, but it's not merely driven by the pandemic, because I think it's also natural after seeing the market has grown and after seeing the dynamics of the fragmentations and about the market segments, it's just natural that consolidation is happening. But I think it's not merely driven by the pandemic too.
Thank you. Any other comments from the other panelists on that particular issue?
Sure. From my perspective, whether we see it in 2021 or 2022, but in general, we are dealing, as long as we're dealing with the digital economy, we will be dealing with consolidation by segment and by vertical, because the economics of a digital business are such that they operate at scale, and therefore whoever gets scaling up through acquisitions or through just sheer organic growth will create consolidation by default, right? So if I'm just the biggest, the best, because I can grow my company the biggest, the best, I create market share consolidation. And if I keep also buying, then I will concentrate the market even faster. So from that perspective, we have no doubt that if you look at it in very, very long-term perspectives, it will be consolidated. From what we see today is that the innovation is still at an extremly high speed. The opportunity is very large. So therefore, you get through an illusion of current fragmentation, if you will. There's so many startups, there's so many other companies that are jumping in the market, each addressing one piece and one bit of the market. And that creates, in a way, a very active marketplace for the moment. But there's no doubt, at least in my mind, that eventually, almost sector by sector, vector by vector, they will consolidate.
Yeah. No, I tend to agree. And I think it kind of like depends on the type. Like fintech, there's a lot of different businesses and a lot of different business models. And for some business models, it's truly a distribution play, and networks effects are very strong. And when that's the case, then often it is winner take all or winner take most. And in those cases, you see consolidation to drive that. Those that have distribution will be able to, bolt on different products that either they build or they buy, right? So that is one dynamic that you've seen play out, and you've seen some of the larger players, whether that is Grab or whether it's Gojek or whether it's Tokopedia or others, acquire companies, often in the fintech space, to strengthen their capabilities in that area. I think what COVID adds to that is, and we've seen that not just in Indonesian fintech, but more broadly in the region and potentially even globally, is that some companies are accelerated by COVID and some struggle. And when they struggle, the teams might be still great, the product might be still great, but they're struggling on the go-to-market, or they're struggling on fundraising and capital, etc. And they might become interesting targets to be acquired by the players that have navigated pandemic better, if you like. So different dynamics are at play, but net agree with what the previous panelists said as well around consolidation likely continuing.
Thank you. Just looking forward, I mean, what are the key opportunities and challenges that Indonesia's fintech sector faces, and what does Indonesia need to put in place to sort of win this regional and global competition, or at least be well placed within it? Perhaps William is.
Yeah. So okay, I would start about the fintech opportunity. So basically, we're still seeing like the fintech in Indonesia are still scratching the surface, both in terms of customer reach and product adoptions in terms of behavioral shift. Because we see even like some of the regulations about P2P lending, the POJK was just released like 4 years ago, 2016 and others. So we're pretty much in the second phase of introductions. And I think we are currently in a growing pain mode because growth is uncomfortable sometimes. And we've had our fair share of issues in customer protections, collection ethics, and others. So we're still working on it as an ecosystem, setting the price ceiling, the price floor, and others. And we think to make it more interesting in the regional and global stage, of course, the coverage of the services, especially like in tier 2, tier 3 cities, because right now most of the coverage are, I would say, it's still in the Jabodetabek area, in Java area. Our challenge is like how we can distribute more in more areas, we cover more areas, because I think to be able to speak in the region and globally, we need to have skill, right? But before that, we need to be able to skill within our countries first. Like, so we need to figure out more on the business model and operating models. So I think that is like the challenge that we need to tackle together, and I think we're seeing good progress so far.
Thank you. Maybe Andy on that one. Still on mute.
I'm sorry, I'm doing this again. There's 2 mute buttons. We've seen all over the world 2 things: very, very smart regulators and very smart governments make room for the industry, and some that are equally smart but try to preempt. They actually slow down the industry. The fintech industry is extremely creative as an industry, and you cannot possibly predict the direction it may take. You can predict a few trends and try to support the industry with those few trends. But if you try to predict too much, then you start procrastinating, you start creating problems for the industry. So what I wish that Indonesia doesn't do, the regulators and the government in Indonesia don't do, is try to predict the future too much and try to play with the industry too much. Let the market happen, let the innovation happen. We see fantastic innovation and fantastic market dynamics, or if you will, if I were to err, whether no regulation at all and just industry, or strong regulation on the other side with the support of the industry, I'd rather err on the no regulation side. It feels like the market enhances and develops very fast, and regulators and governments are good at catching up, but they're not good at leading. So it would be best if industry leads and regulators and governments follow and watch and support what the industry is telling them to support, what the industry is demonstrating that they need support with, including what you guys have mentioned, digital signatures, shared databases of fraud, shared databases of consumers that of credit. Quality of consumers and businesses, etc. So there will be a lot of opportunities where the government can intervene, can help, can help the industry do things that the industry on its own cannot do, and then stay out of everything that the industry can solve itself. And that would be what I wish every country to do, because we see massive growth and massive acceleration in industries where the regulator has just the right touch.
I echo that. I like how you ended that, the right touch, but defining what that right touch is, I think is often the challenge. And you don't want to be controlling. You do want to be enabling. And sometimes it's hard to strike that balance. And in some industries, in some countries, the lobby from incumbents might be very strong, and it's harder to actually move forward. And some regulations is more to control and maintain status quo than to move forward. Fortunately, we've seen better things in this part of the world, in Indonesia, but also, for example, in India, where we're very active. If you look at what's happened there in fintech, the government has actually enabled a lot of fintech to emerge with what they call UPI, Universal Payment Infrastructure, with the establishment of universal QR codes, which is now happening in Malaysia as well. And actually the interoperability of payment acceptance, whether that is universal QR or UPI or national merchant ID and things like that. And so if there is an enabling role of the government in those areas, a more robust credit bureau, for example, as well, or quality control on the capital markets, these things are actually building the infrastructure layer on which a lot of private market companies can flourish. And I think, coming back, that right touch is, minimum control only where it's needed to drive the right incentives for the industry and the players and protecting consumers, etc. But beyond that, staying away and just playing at that enabling infrastructure layer.
I'm not sure whether how closely you've been following the job creation law or the omnibus law, as some have called it. I mean, I wonder how much difference that'll make to the investment environment, particularly for tech, William.
Yeah, so I think what we see is like the ease of doing business. So we focus like some things like the ease of doing business will be interesting angle for investments. And I think it's still really like the big picture. We as a stakeholder, we need to, follow on with the tactical practice later on. But we see like, especially in tech are mostly white collar. So I think the impact is not as massive like as the industry in general. But I think in terms of investments, it attracts more investments because we see like the potential ease of doing business is putting into effect. So,
okay, I'm not sure if is that something you've been following, Peter or Andy?
Me.
Sure. Okay. Well, from Singapore perspective, Peter, I know Singapore seems to have been looking closely at it. Sorry,
Singapore's looking closely at. I missed.
Just the job creation law, this sort of omnibus law that President Jokowi's government has put through, with changing multiple laws at once to try and improve the ease of doing business, which obviously has been an issue for Indonesia in terms of attracting investment in general, perhaps more manufacturing investment. But I was wondering whether that would translate to tech as well.
I think in general, Singapore is a very different business environment, and obviously has been during COVID as well quite supportive with support for companies. I think generally one of the things I'm seeing more, not as much comparing Indonesia to Singapore, but for example, some Southeast Asia markets with what we're seeing in Europe, for example, where I'm originally from, and where you see very, very strict labor laws, and it's actually really hard to hire people, to fire people, and the cost of doing business are very high, and specifically for startups. If it becomes really hard to hire someone because you know that if it doesn't work out or the business is going down, you're stuck with someone for 6 months or for a year, the risk of hiring becomes harder. People will think much harder before they scale. And so having flexibility in your labor markets is very important. And if those laws that are being announced in Indonesia are supporting of that, then I think that will have a big impact on job creation, and specifically in startups where that flexibility of labor is very much needed.
Thank you.
I'll probably just add one flavor. Sorry, Ed.
No, go ahead, please.
No, I'll just add one flavor that labor laws and labor regulation and labor philosophies are very, very long-term plays. So while you can fix or tweak instances of a certain industry or a certain macroeconomic situation within a year or two, in general, you have to coordinate almost every philosophical, every economic philosophy together. Competition, what Peter was mentioning, the ease of creating the businesses and closing down the businesses, the ease of bankruptcies, etc., plus education, plus government policies with regards to general education, to early stage education, to vocational education, through attracting of foreign direct investments. All that stuff will somehow all get together. So my one concern is that if you try easy fixes, it's not going to work. If you take very, very long-term points of view and build properly, you will not be remunerated in the next election, but you do get remunerated eventually in decades.
Just looking at stock exchange listings, a way that we've obviously got, a number of unicorns, hackathons. I'm just wondering, what else the IDX can do to make it attractive for tech listings, so that, obviously quite a few have been going abroad, but, are we looking at a time when Indonesia will have a lot more listings? Perhaps that's one for William.
Yeah, so I think it's something that we're very keen and we're following, because we see like there's recent development in the past year, like the development board, the acceleration board, even like the IDX incubator that help companies to prepare themselves and going public. And I think in recent years, there's more and more tech companies are going public in IDX. Even in mid this year, there's a company that went public too, the POS. And I think it's a positive signal going forward, because like I said earlier, we're just entering our second decade. So I think it's crucial for VC funds to get liquidity. And I think the more options that we have for liquidity options, the better. So in the past 10 years, some of the VCs, the exits are primarily M&A, consolidations, or secondary. So I think going public in Indonesia are more feasible this year. And because if not, we need to return monies to LPs, right, to the institutional backer. So I think the more options that we get, so I think everybody's are putting more effort and attentions to the listing part. And I think also the public would see to have more options for investing, right? So because the tech companies, people are more aware compared to 5 years, 10 years ago. So I think for investors, for retail investors too, if there's more options, it will be interesting. And the risk appetite for tech investing is also growing. So I think we're on track because of the recent development of the flexibility on the accelerations and development board. And I think this is something that us as an investor should be encouraging.
Is that one you're looking at from your end, Peter?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with exchanges is always like, if they make it really hard to list, that's not great in some ways, but it also warrants kind of like the quality of the businesses. And what you see in some of the US exchanges, for example, is that the revenue scale that was expected before going public has just gone up over time. And if you have lower revenue and lower scale, you can potentially list, but coverage will be low and liquidity will be low, and it won't be an optimum environment for you as a company. If you look at Australia, on the other hand, they've made it much easier to list. But you see companies at a really small scale list, and that's, what's the right way of saying it? It's sometimes frowned upon if it's too easy, because it's no longer a sign of approval than when you actually list. So trying to strike that balance, I think, is an important one. And I think what you're seeing, at least from a tech point of view, is that many folks that will be eyeing to list at some stage will be potentially considering dual listings. where they have some of the benefits of listing in Indonesia. And often there's a deep sense of patriotism in a way as well that ties into that, and some other benefits. But then also list in the US where obviously they can unlock more capital and can get more liquidity and coverage and so on. And so focusing on enabling that and having a process to simplify these types of dual listings might be beneficial for the tech ecosystem in the long run.
Thank you. Is that one, Andy, you follow?
I'll just add that if you look at it from the perspective of the public market investor, they get married to two things when they choose an exchange. They get married both to the companies that get listed in the exchange, but they also get married to the currency of the exchange and the rules of the exchange. So they get deeper into Indonesia, if you will, and therefore it's not just the exchange that needs to support the investment, that needs to make sure that there is transparency, that there is rules, that companies that are listed abide by the transparency rules, that there are no surprises that blow up the stock prices. But also the macro situation of Indonesia has to be supportive. That is beyond what the stock exchange can do. But the currency has to be stable, etc. So that when investors take those bets, they want to take company bets. They want to take fewer macro bets as possible. So from that perspective, I think there's things that the exchange can do, and they should do very carefully and very methodically to make sure that the transparency, that the liquidity, etc., for as much as they can control, is at the maximum. And then there is the part of the government of Indonesia to make sure that the macro environment around the exchange is also healthy and supportive of the listings.
Thank you. Just going on a slight divergence, but bearing in mind Finance Minister Sri Mulyani Indrawati has warned that the pandemic could set back Indonesian poverty levels by a decade. I mean, we've talked a bit about this, I think, earlier in the in talks today, but what role can fintech and digital services play to allow these services across sort of socioeconomic classes? I mean, especially I'm talking about the poor and the most vulnerable, which is obviously a large grouping in Indonesia.
Maybe one perspective that I could volunteer. What you're seeing in many markets is that it set back economic growth, and obviously there's a risk to that. But what it has also done is it has made people realize how important digital is, and how important it is to automate and rely less on manual activities, manual touch points, paperwork, etc. And specifically in an archipelago like Indonesia, where many folks, it's generally harder to have direct reach, direct connection, logistics, etc. Driving that digital growth and digitization of supply chain, of workflows, of administration, etc. I think is very important. And you're seeing that actually being accelerated right now, not just in Indonesia, but elsewhere. And so many companies, and again, not just the largest companies, but also the small warrooms, etc., are embracing technology much more. And I think, not to say that there's no risk, but there's actually an interesting opportunity where you see actually an acceleration of that digitization across all layers of society and of all layers of business as well.
Thank you. Is that one, Andy, at the IFC? Is there a particular?
Well, from my personal perspective, I see finance, if you will, as a necessary evil in a way. That no consumer in the world, no business in the world wants specifically money. They actually want whatever they can buy with the money. They want to finance whatever they want to consume, whatever they want to invest in. So in a way, finance is the necessary evil, and it takes quite a big chunk of the GDP of a country. So if you look, most countries, financial services is between 10 and 20%. In some markets that have become financial centers of the world, it's even more than that. So from that perspective, it is a non-productive burden on the economy. What I like about our industry is that through both inclusion and cost cutting, it is likely to become a more useful industry. while burdening less the economy. So from that perspective, I actually find it that the evolution that we see in the technology, in the processes, in the operations of the companies that we support, and the underlying service that they provide to the economy at a much lower cost, almost on a constant basis, will create that environment where finance is extremely useful. It helps the economy the way it is supposed to, but at a much lower cost. So therefore, letting the rest of the economy, the food, the health, the education economy, the manufacturing economy, the real economy, if you will, to breathe a little bit more easily.
Thank you. Just touching on e-wallets and how you see the sort of payment sector progressing in Indonesia. I mean, this seems to be one area that's fast changing and being adopted. Particularly all my staff are far ahead of me at adopting different systems and seem to change regularly. So I wondered how you saw that going forward. Perhaps William on that one.
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting because we see like Pierre mentioned, like we experience setbacks on a macro level, but to some extent we also experience like digital accelerations and talking about e-wallets and e-money. So I think we see the trends are going like embedded finance is going stronger here, where the needs of financial services to make multiple sectors or tech companies that primarily are not financial services is real. We see like the adoption is getting massive. Like people, the behavior shift are changing. So we see like going forward, like for example in the US, we see like the adoption of PayPal back then. It was powered by the commerce sectors, by the eBay, PayPal, and we see this starting by the old tech companies, the unicorns, the ride-hailing, increase powering the adoptions, and now people are getting used to it. And I think even looking at the market here, it's still in tier 1, so the room to grow in tier 2 and tier 3 cities is still massive, and we're gonna see more of embedded finance role in the societies even further. We see like all companies are adopting digital decisions, and tech is getting more. And I think it's a net positive for the economy and societies in general.
Thank you. Peter, are you following the payments, particularly in Indonesia and e-wallet?
To some extent, and I mentioned earlier, obviously, with Indonesia being one of the largest cash societies in the world, there is this massive opportunity. I mentioned earlier some of the things that I think can gradually be improved at the infrastructure layer. But what is interesting is that the impact of companies like Gojek that have built so much distribution and so much frequency of use, as we often call it, right? Like many use cases that they offer. And so embedding payment from the early days with GoPay as one example has just been kind of interesting to see. And so that made them actually invest, and the same is true for Tokopedia to some extent, for Grab to some extent, made them invest early on in payments and just realizing that like go-to-market and customer acquisition cost is often a key driver for these businesses to be successful or not. So when you have distribution already, your customer acquisition cost to have someone for your wallet or payment solution, either online or offline, is just much more favorable. And so the question is how that landscape will play out, what niches are open for specific use cases or smaller players, or whether this is one of the examples that we talked about earlier, where the network effects are so strong and where it's a winner-take-all or winner-take-most type of environment, and where the big players like Grab, Gojek, Tokopedia, and some others will basically dominate that landscape from a digital payment point of view. So it's interesting to see how that plays out.
Is that something from a global perspective you're following, Andy?
Absolutely, and we have the same philosophies as Peter. We do share their views that when it comes to luxury goods, for example, people don't want the same. They don't want to be wearing the same stuff you're wearing. They want to be driving a different car that you're driving. But when it comes to money, they want the same money that everybody else has. So the network economics and the commodity type of service will drive wallets to a massive concentration. So theoretically speaking, you don't need more than one per country. You may want, just for competitive reasons, to make sure that they all stay in their own lane and therefore keep driving and keep innovating. But you really, from a consumer perspective, you don't need more than one. So as long as that is, it's useful everywhere, you can use it in all or most use cases, etc. The consumers will choose one and will probably stick with one, or choose two and stick with two. But whether it is 1, 2, or 3, we're still talking about a massive consolidation of the interface between the consumer and the financial service provider. So I don't know how many banks Indonesia has, but I would imagine it's 60 plus. I can't see how with the kind of distribution network of what you call the new wallets, or what we may call in some instances the neobanks. I just cannot see why a consumer would want to deal with a regional bank, a small regional bank, or a bank with subpar service, etc., while they can have the best digital experience with one of the large national players. So we see that in country by country. It's a very, very obvious pattern.
Thank you. I mean, great point Peter makes on the cash. Certainly there is a lot more cash around than in some other countries right now in Indonesia, which I'm sure won't rapidly change, but it could do if this take up continues at that sort of pace. I mean, in terms of an investor, I mean, is now a good time because the pandemic creates opportunities, or is it a waiting game now until things stabilize and things are clearer? I mean, what is the sort of investment strategy from your perspective? Maybe from William.
Yeah. So as a venture investor, so we are getting used to invest in risk. Risk is part of the game, right? So it's a matter of how we can adjust the risk. We can identify the risk. So I think it's pretty much still a good time to invest, because we see like a lot of problems that are emerged that need solutions. And I think the interest of global investors too. So I think most of them, the decline of capital injections to Indonesia this time, it's morely a delay rather than a decline in interest. So I think the potential is still massive. So this pandemic just shows like how we need to invest more in digital, in our technology adoptions that can solve real problems. And like I mentioned earlier, like we still basically scratching the surface on Java Island Tier 1 series, so there's still room to grow in Indonesia. And I think a lot of sectors are showing their resiliency to show that it's not just fad, it's a real problem that is worth to tackle, that's worth to invest, that is worth to be covered by all the innovative new companies. So I think it's a very interesting time to be in. And for us as a venture investor, it's just we need to both us and the companies need to identify the risk even further and prepare our mitigation plan. It's always a game of risk.
And just out of interest, sorry, William, are you noticing, you talked about obviously certain parts of Indonesia, Jakarta, Bandung, Bali, maybe there's a lot more activity going on. Are you seeing signs of more activity in some of the other islands or elsewhere in Java, outside Bandung and Jakarta, perhaps?
Yeah, but we think like the digital and technology adoptions are relatively low other than the cities that we mentioned. So that are the room to grow for companies to expand more, I would say.
But can you have a sort of tech company in Sulawesi and Kalimantan and Papua or other areas?
Yeah.
Is there the infrastructure there?
It's the vision. The vision is like for the companies to expand, at least to have the presence that covers there, because talking about tech companies, we're talking about the companies that has the ability to scale in terms of geography and others. So I think it shouldn't be a problem, and I think it should be within the roadmap of all the companies now to cover Indonesia as a whole, not just like on the metro area.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on the investment climate right now?
Yeah, I think, frankly, for us, we just know that the market is cyclical, and sometimes it pays to be anti-cyclical. And we have realized that some of the best companies have actually been born in tough times. And so during the great financial crisis, Sequoia, I should say, started investing in companies like Dropbox and Stripe and Airbnb that in a 10, 12-year time frame have become very, very large companies. And what we're seeing right now as well is we've actually been incredibly active over the last year. Just early this morning, we announced another 17 companies where Sequoia led investments through its search program, including companies in Indonesia. And out of that have come previous companies in Indonesia, like Bukukas, for example. That is one of these companies that is digitizing the bookkeeping for warung owners, and there's many, many merchants on the platform. And many of these investments have been done during COVID and have been done fully remote without sometimes meeting the team. But we've just seen an incredible business opportunities. We've seen incredible founders. We've seen when the risk in typical companies is higher, there's actually less opportunity cost. And so more people actually start businesses, right? They might be made redundant, or they might see less opportunity in traditional businesses. So from an investment point of view, it's not just it's not as much for us a higher risk, because again, this thing will pass, as they say. But the time is now to start businesses, and we've seen many folks do that, and have backed a lot of very strong founders. So we're quite excited by the investment landscape, more broadly in Southeast Asia, but in Indonesia specifically also.
Thank you. Andy, any thoughts on the climate in particular?
I'll add some color. I feel like I'm generally a happier seller than a happier buyer in Indonesia for the moment. We see quite a few companies that have shot up in price beyond the point where we are willing buyers. But in general, I think this is where the color and this is where the nuance comes in. In general, if you pick up the right businesses, the businesses that will be around for 15 years, I still say, even though you would be paying some sort of an astronomical price today, there's still so much growth. I'm talking about fintech players that will be around in the next 10, 15 years. There's still so much growth. There's still so much market share that they can gain from the incumbents. There is still so much, so many new customers that are joining in the marketplace, whether that's consumers or businesses. There's so many still new products that can be deployed in the market, so many financial products. So from that perspective, if you are a patient investor, like we are, and you invest in the right business models that you think will be around no matter what in the next 20 years, then I think there's no better time. It's now.
I'm just fascinated with your background from Albania. I mean, do you see similar patterns in Indonesia as the sort of as has happened in Albania, or it's all happening around the same time? Or so you must have started from a very low base there.
That's correct. Well, the beauty of small markets is that they are a little bit more easy to understand. It's like looking at a makeup model versus looking at the entire building in real life form, right? So understanding a small market like my home market is pretty straightforward, and then you can use that pattern recognition for other markets. But obviously, when it comes to industries like this that are industries of scale, you just cannot get the same economies of scale in a market like Albania. So the innovation, while it may happen in small pockets, you will never get the speed that we can expect it to hit Indonesia. The same way it has happened in China, it has happened in India, it has happened in the United States. It has happened in the joint Europe rather than the separate Europe, if you will. So the moment Europe unified its regulatory regime in financial services, then you get this super giant players that can accelerate their growth across countries. So again, it's interesting, and we don't know. It is a very good debate to start. Where do small countries fit, and how do they innovate in such a rapidly accelerating financial services world? And what is the role of big countries and the small countries when all the dust settles? We have this theory, or at least I have the theory, that regulatory barriers will have to come down. Otherwise, some markets will stay far behind the markets that advance.
Thank you. Just a reminder that you can put any questions into the questions and answer. I think we have one question asking about the role of the regulator, OJK, and financial inclusion and education, if I've correctly translated that, and how companies can work with the regulator, I suppose. William, are you working closely with OJK?
Yeah, as an associations, representing associations, we're closely hold talks and other discussions with the regulators, especially talking about customer protections and others. So I think the role for us is like gathering like the feedback of multiple stakeholders and participants on how we can govern this further. And I think a lot of talks has been happening happening right now, and we think like, of course, we would like to catch the aspiration of the players and of the regulators in terms of milestones that we need to achieve, and I think all of the stuff that that is being asked is happening right now. It's ongoing.
Okay. And just a thought on, obviously with the pandemic, there's been pressure on maybe on online lenders in terms of NPLs, and how, I mean, how do you assess credit and make sure that you're getting the right people, getting the right money, and, putting together the investors with people that, can pay back eventually, or, how is that working, do you think, in Indonesia? I mean, particularly now that we're being stress tested by the pandemic, I suppose. And even on a global scale, I suppose, how is this sort of, the risks of lending compared to the, needing to get obviously money out to people? I know bank lending in Indonesia, for instance, I think BI has often been calling for it to, faster pace of bank lending. So, I mean, how can fintech fit into that area?
Maybe one perspective. Again, if you think about lending and you think about customer acquisition, you see that a lot of activities happen around the larger ecosystems, around whether it's Tokopedia or Gojek or Grab, as I mentioned earlier, or some of the lending platforms. When this is increasingly digital, it also means that there's an increasing amount of data available. And so you see more and more companies move away from the offline manual approach to lending to a more digital approach to lending, which has its risks, obviously, but it also has its benefits in terms of being able to tie into transaction data or other data. If you look at, like Sequoia, for example, invested in a company called Trusting Social that can leverage telco data to do credit scoring through a purely opt-in from the borrower approach. And the quality of the data and the signals and the ability to forecast credit worthiness and credit scores, etc., is exceptionally high, actually. And in similar cases, Tokopedia or Gojek would leverage transaction history on their respective platforms to be able to assess some level of credit risk. And none of these models are flawless, but you actually see an increase in an ability to forecast credit worthiness. And you sometimes actually see very healthy NPLs, non-performing loan kind of like ratios within some of these businesses. So it's an interesting space, and during COVID, like obviously risk levels go up. but in general, you see companies getting smarter and smarter in terms of how they assess risk. Much more to be done, but interesting developments from what we can see.
In fact, we've got a follow-up question from the floor from Johan Salim. There are already 200 P2P platforms registered in Indonesia. Do you see any oversaturation on the P2P lending sector, or is there still room for further growth in this sector? Is that one for you, William?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, we have hundreds of registered, but I think the fully licensed is just around 30. And from those numbers, there is no official figure on breakdown between productive and consumptive, but I think from FP, the associations, like the estimate is around 70% of them are in Indonesia right now are consumptive lending, while 30% is for productive. So definitely we see room to grow in terms of productive lending, especially during this time. The trend in Q2, Q3, I think a lot of productive lending is increasing. Like a lot of the P2P players, they are targeting a more, they are readjusting their risk appetite and focus more on the productive lending. And we see it is speed bump, but we still have a huge potential. And if we observe from the players there, I think it's a continuation of my point earlier, like most of them still covers the Java Island. So I think the room to grow beyond that, a lot of underbanked and unbanked populations beyond that is still massive. So I think from 200, maybe we focus on the 30 and how we see a lot of consolidation is going on, because I think from those 200 players, most of them are still testing their operating model and their business model. So I think this is we are still in the growing pain process. So definitely it will be a natural selections from those 200, and I think it will be trimmed down into a healthier number of companies.
Any other thoughts on P2P platforms?
Sure. And I see that as activity increasing, but definitely the number should be decreasing. So the closest business model to P2P lending is what we mentioned earlier, the stock exchange. It doesn't make sense to have 300 stock exchanges in the market. It's a very simple function of basically a meeting point between buyers and sellers. It's a clearinghouse. So if the clearinghouse is extremely efficient and it can produce or originate very good loans, then you don't need thousands of them. The investors should, because you're breaking up not only the operational efficiencies into too many pools, but you're also breaking up the liquidity in too many pools. So it does not make economic sense to have too many, but it does make economic sense to have a lot more activity where investors come into place and buy directly the credit of others.
Yeah, and let me quickly add to that. I think it's really interesting what you just mentioned there. You're adding up the operations, but also liquidity pools. The other thing that you're breaking up, I think, is data and the quality of the models that forecast, credit score, etc., are dependent on the training of those forecasting models, which is dependent on the amount of data. So that's why you see in markets like China or even the US, at some stage these platforms either consolidate or just many companies fall away, and a few bigger companies remain that have the skill and that have the data to fine-tune their models and get better and better in assessing risk. And that's a very important factor here as well, I think.
And just putting Indonesia in perspective of Southeast Asia and globally, I mean, obviously Indonesia has this very big population and a young population. I mean, when you're dealing with investors, I mean, I've spoken to some Chinese investors who say they saw Indonesia as China at an earlier stage, which I think that was sort of more in the e-commerce area. But I just wondered how you see Indonesia progressing. Is it going to be sort of, you're going to have investors, global investors, you're going to have, a sort of Chinese model of certain things. Obviously in e-commerce, there seems to be a lot of Chinese investment, perhaps compared, and you haven't had the Amazons of this world directly invest in e-commerce, for instance. I know we're talking fintech, but I just wondered how you see Indonesia's position in Southeast Asia and globally now. maybe one for Andy.
Sure, I can volunteer that. So at a very fundamental level, we don't see much differences between markets. Markets are unifying in many ways. So the consumers are behaving the same. The companies are offering similar products at similar speeds with similar innovation patterns, etc. And investors obviously are crossing borders looking for opportunities left and right. So there's really no market that is left behind, really. So from that perspective, it is possible that China and Indonesia will follow similar paths. Where I see the difference between China and Indonesia is the forcefulness of the government in guiding the industry or guiding the sector. China is a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more rigorous in how they pursue and how they guide the opportunities or how they guide the markets. Which obviously carries the risk that if they actually get it wrong, they screw up the entire market. Indonesia is a little bit more laid back, or where the regulator is a little bit more behind the scene, which is usually my favorite model, which means the government or the regulator will never be a factor in accelerating the industry, but will stay in the background to make sure that the industry does not create problems, if you will, for itself. So from that perspective, the only thing that I see a difference between China and Indonesia is exactly that. And of course, you can talk about education, you can talk about the readiness of the consumer and the readiness of the business. But other than that, I think it's just a matter of time. All markets are headed in the same or similar direction, and they all will be there in the next 30 years or so.
Thank you.
I think, if I may add, I think it's interesting to see how Indonesia has become an attractive market at the global stage. I think when Tokopedia raised a $100 million round in around mid-2014, it was for the first time, I think, that the rest of Southeast Asia and perhaps Asia saw Indonesia shine, and it's marked by many as an inflection point. But that was at the Asia scale. Then what happened in 2016, when at least the investment and venture markets were down a bit, exactly at that time, when raising capital for many startups was quite tough, Gojek raised 550 million for a domestic play, not for a global or regional, but for a domestic company at that stage. And I think that is when many people globally took note, because that round included global names in the private equity industry like Capital Group and Warburg Pincus, DST, who had invested even before that, I believe, Sequoia, and we initially led the Series A in the beginning of 2015. And I think since then, globally, investors have been looking at Indonesia, and whether that's U.S. investors, earlier last month, Tokopedia announced an investment from Google, obviously from the US, as well as Temasek from Singapore. So I think whether it's Chinese or US or other Asian investors, I think Indonesia has become a force to be reckoned with and a market that is attracting capital. And I think it's just continuing to be like that if you look at just the scale that many of these companies are reaching. So I think it's very exciting.
Any thoughts on that, William?
Yeah. I remember the time that Peter mentioned, like 2014. It was like really when Indonesia was put on the map globally. Because I've been a VC since 2011. Back then, before then, 2011, 2014, nobody knows what I'm doing back then. It was not too popular as now. VC wasn't even a job back then, right? So I think we've drawn a lot of comparisons to China, maybe because of the demographic, but I think on the market behavior, it's really on its own, and I think it's in its unique way and in a positive way. Because if you see like e-commerce player, if it's the leading e-commerce player in Indonesia only, and e-commerce player that won the rest of Southeast Asia, if you see the comparison, the valuation is like, even they're just operating in Indonesia only, they're much more valuable rather than the company who won the rest Southeast Asia. So I think the market is big enough to be the home of multiple unicorns, and I think it's upward trends for now, and it's still relatively young. We just went through one cycle, just one decade. So I think the overall trajectory is really positive. And I think we will show more or our own color, I think, in this first half of this decade.
Thank you. Okay, well, we'll probably shortly wrap up, but let me know if there are any final thoughts you have as investors, maybe looking towards 2021. Are you excited? I mean, you mentioned, Peter, you were still excited with Indonesia, or is it cautious optimism?
I think as investors, we always have to be cautious, and it's always drinking the Kool-Aid and being excited whilst being fully aware. And within Sequoia, we have this big mindset of what we call get real, and on future investments or things we're evaluating, as well as portfolio companies, the focus is to be very honest and intellectually honest about what's working and what's not, and balancing the excitement and passion for a certain company or founder with the reality of how hard it is to build business and how much risks there are, and how many flaws early stage startups invariably have. But yeah, it is very exciting. I think if you look at again, the number of war rooms and how that is being digitized, and the role of fintech in that, it's massive. If you look at Indonesia as the largest Muslim population, Sharia has been talked about a lot, but hasn't really taken off. But I think there will be more opportunities in that space. I think many areas are still to be developed, and specifically in wealth management as well. I think one of the things you often see when you think about the evolution of fintech, it starts with payments, it then goes on to lending, and then goes on to insurance. And so, with Sequoia, we initially backed Midtrans in the payment space. In the lending space, we are behind Modalku in peer-to-peer SME lending. Sequoia invested in Koala and InsurTech. I think what is next will be things like wealth management and investments. And that has grown a lot already, like I think 10x in the last 5 years when it comes to mutual fund investors, etc. And even when it comes to stock investors, they've grown like 3x in the same period. And many of them are millennials, and that's driving a lot of adoption for digital fintech products. So lots of opportunity lies ahead, I believe.
Thank you. Any final thoughts, Andy?
No, equally excited. It is a market where, again, as I said, if you are patient enough and you choose the right companies, you will do well, even though they are pricey right now, and we don't like it as buyers. But we don't complain much, because as everybody in my panel says, the opportunity is very large. The market is still very virgin. The growth is multi-vector, so there's a lot of forces that are growing our industry. So we are buyers in general. In the end, we're buyers.
Yeah.
Great. And lastly, William.
Yeah, so we had talks in the associations at Amfesindo and consensus. All the other investors, we see like this year is a speed bump, but the potential remains huge, and we see from multiple investor standpoint, like respond this positively, especially like looking at more companies, especially in the tech startups, that are eyeing local listings as the options, and how the local listings is also a response that positively, and see the role of the financial services in terms of tech and multiple sectors beyond that is also exciting. The trend of embedded finance, even like the global investors, Andreessen Horowitz mentioned in one of the podcasts, like every companies will become some sort of fintech in a way. So we see like the growth of financial services, the embedded finance to the overall tech ecosystem is positive. So a lot of innovation on how we work on venture investing, startup product development, and others in 2021 will be very interesting.
Thank you. So just summing up, I mean, general optimism there, and I mean, obviously from the regulatory perspective, it sounds like the right touch is it that makes sure things are fixed when they need to be, but not necessarily trying to think too far ahead in such a changing environment. So on that note, I'd just like to thank the panelists and for an interesting discussion, and I look forward to more in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edward.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to Mr. Edward Davis and all our distinguished speakers for a very exciting discussion on Fintech today. Ladies and gentlemen, now the last part from this session in the limelight with the topic how Fintech can support Indonesia's agent networks to advance financial inclusion at the last mile. In this session, we have speakers, a partner, consumer-centric CCX, digital financial expert, Digital Ambassador UNCDF, a co-founder Eco India Financial Services. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Anna Gisherman, Ayas Mita, and Abhinav Sinha.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be part of this conference. Would like to thank the FinTech team at OJK and Patreon for inviting me to moderate this important session. Over the last few years, I've had the privilege of working with the Indonesian government for supporting the Financial Inclusion Secretariat at Kemenko, and most recently collaborating with Ibu Nur Haida and Patreon as part of the Bellagio Working Group on Digital Financial Inclusion. The Bellagio Group brings together senior policymakers from Nigeria, Egypt, Indonesia to jointly problem-solve challenges on the way to greater digital financial inclusion in their respective countries. So the topic of today's discussion on how to leverage FinTech to harness the full potential of agent banking is one of the most important discussion themes in the Bellagio Group, and we have been learning from experience in each of the three countries, as well from a number of global case studies and experts. So today we are very lucky to have two such prominent experts with us. Abhinav Sinha is a co-founder of Eco Financial Services, India's largest cash-to-digital network. And Ayas Mita is a global DFS and FinTech expert, currently serving as the digital ambassador to UNCDF and acts as a senior advisor to the UN Secretary General Task Force of Digital Financing of the SDGs, and also the dialogue on governance of big FinTech. Okay, Ayas, that's a mouthful. But before we turn to them, to the two experts, let's just kind of quickly take stock of where agent banking is in Indonesia today. And there are so many accomplishments to be proud of. Well, according to the 2019 OJK survey, more than 3/4 of the population has access to financial services. This is largely due to the successful digitization of key G2P programs, expansion of the digital payment and CRIS networks, and incredible advancement in FinTech development and deployment. The agent banking infrastructure expanded tremendously as well, while occupying the agents well exceeding the 1 million mark, the number of CRIS merchants reaching almost 5 million, that's incredible. However, despite all of those successes, still 1/4 of the population doesn't have access to financial services. And the Indonesians who don't own accounts use them infrequently for a very limited number of use cases. So another set of challenges is around where the existing agents are. Most of them are not in rural areas. Many of them are barely breaking even or even operating at a loss. So the question is, how do we leverage fintech, or how can fintech help achieve kind of three things? Expanding the current footprint to advance to the last mile, expanding a range of services available to customers, and optimizing existing business models to come up with solutions that are both scalable but also profitable for both agents and providers. So to tackle this question, it's now the time to turn to Abhinav and Ayaz to get some ideas, some answers from their experience in India and other markets. We will start with Abhinav and kind of Echo's unique business model that operates at two levels as a agent banking network manager, as well as a technology provider to third-party agent networks. So Abhinav, can you please tell us about Echo, kind of those two business lines, and if you can specifically focus on kind of three things. How do you build a footprint that goes beyond urban centers? Talk about kind of a broader basket of use cases to customers, and also touch on profitability kind of for agents, but also for Echo as a provider, as well as your partners, the third-party agents. So over to you, Abhinav.
Thank you so much, Anna, and good morning to everyone. Let me just set the context for all of you, especially because we are operating here in India. We've got about 1.3 billion people, and across the country there are about officially there are about 18 different languages that people speak across the country. And I started Echo, which is India's largest cash to digital network, serving the low and moderate income customers here in India. For the last 13 years, we've been running this network for the last 13 years. And we were confronted with this aspect of how do we grow and service 1.3 billion people in India. Now, the first part of Anna's question was, we do operate in two different models. One is we act as the agent network manager, while on the other hand, we also work as a technology provider. So for instance, pretty much like any network agent network managers, we also have our own dashboard for agents. We have our own apps for the agent. And we typically use digital media to create awareness amongst the prospective agents across the country, and try and create awareness amongst them, and try and convert them. And thereafter, the entire conversion cycle, or whether it's about training, we more and more we are only going towards online training versus in-person training or classroom training. So we run a agent network ourselves. On the other hand, what we realized when we were scaling this network in India is that across very large geographies and across very different social structures as well as languages, it was getting very difficult for Echo to be able to scale across geographies. And one of the things that we did way back in 2015 was that we opened up our backend, and we completely transformed up our technology stack into an open API technology stack, which enabled entrepreneurs across the country who wanted to build a similar business as we were building. The open API platform gave those entrepreneurs all the tools to make their own applications and portals for agents and start acquiring agents on their own. So the acquisition of agents and scaling up of Echo's network across geographies, whether it was urban or rural, now got divided. Not only now that responsibility was not there only with Echo, but now started to get distributed amongst many entrepreneurs who wanted to participate in growing of that network. And I'm very happy to share with all of you that today Echo powers more than 300 other networks apart from powering its own network. And where we learned this, we started to look at, a platform like Android. And if you look at it, Google builds Pixel smartphones on its Android platform. However, also allows thousands of other smartphone manufacturers to build their smartphone products on Android. So we've done something very similar. So we create our own dashboards for retailers, but we also empower other entrepreneurs to build their dashboards, their applications, and acquire the network on their own. So like I said, we've got a network of close to about 300,000 agents across the country in India, and this is growing spectacularly right now, whether pre-COVID, post-COVID. And we continue to acquire a lot of these entrepreneurs on a monthly basis. And I'm very happy to share that 2/3 of our transaction and 2/3 of our network today in 2020 is brought in by our partnering network, and only about 1/3 of our network is what Echo has built on its own through our own app. And the third-party network only started about 5 years ago, while we've been running Echo for the last 13 years. So you can imagine the scale that opens up as soon as open APIs are embraced, and other entrepreneurs and developers are encouraged to build an ecosystem around the platform that we've created. That's really.
Can I sorry to interrupt, but an interesting point that you always make by collaborating with those third-party networks, it kind of allows for customization of the solution to their particular geographic areas. Is that the case?
Absolutely.
Kind of
Thank you so much for bringing that.
Languages. Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point and so relevant to Indonesia, which also has a number of languages, ethnic groups, etc. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for bringing that. Thanks a lot for bringing that point. Absolutely, because when entrepreneurs come from different geographies, they create solutions which may be cash in and cash out, but those applications and those dashboards and those SMSs that go out to the customers are a lot more regional, a lot more culturally suited that they send us as compared to what Echo would send. So I think while we do give them the tools to build the app, I think every app is different and every app is customized to an urban area of a particular geography, and it's really, really beautiful. So it has really helped in us, in our platform and the reach for financial services to really go as deep as possible.
And kind of that aspect of the business model from a profitability perspective, how do you think about kind of the agent profitability, and kind of your own and the profitability of providers? Because that's, of course, it's a challenge across the world, right? So
sure. I'm happy to share that what we see is that as far as agent level profitability is concerned, fundamentally, if there are enough products which have a reasonable demand, we do not, at least in India, we do not see agents struggling with profitability. But there are possibilities that while you're growing your network, there is a possibility that every agent does not have large enough market for them to service, for them to have enough revenues for them on a month-on-month basis. Now, I'm sure many networks are experiencing this. We experience this ourselves. Now, I personally, having worked and built a network for the last 13 years, I personally do not believe that there isn't enough demand for this service. What I think is that there isn't, in certain geographies, there isn't enough awareness about the service. As a result of it, there aren't too many walk-ins into these agents for the services that these guys provide. So I definitely want to make this distinction that if there are the banking products available and a few other products available at an agent, I do not believe that the retailer, the agents cannot make enough money for them to be profitable and sustainable on a month-on-month basis. In case there is an example where they are not making enough profit for themselves, I think it's a problem of demand generation rather than profitability of the product themselves. That's how we see this in India. And therefore, it is important to kind of help them generate that amount of demand and awareness in their geographies for enough people to come and take the service. As far as profitability of agent networks like ours and our partners are concerned, what we've realized is that typically these transactions that we process at an agent do not have enough margins for the network, for the agent network managers like ourselves. And therefore, over a period of time, what we've realized is that there are two aspects to this. Keep adding relevant products for agents to sell more products. So we continue to add a portfolio of products, wherein the footfall at the agent continues to increase. Because while these transactions do not have margins, but at least an addition every time is an add-on to everybody, whether it is to the agent or to ourselves. Secondly, which is the flavor going forward, is that it is extremely important to start to build business models around data monetization. I think it's extremely important to start to understand our agents better. It is very, very critical to start to understand the consumers better, basis their transactional behavior and a few other data points and signals which are getting generated while these transactions are happening. And I think and once we start to understand our agents and consumers far better, I think better products, whether it is to do with credit, whether it's to do with insurance, whether it's to do with savings, whether it's to do with wealth management, and I'm talking about financial services, and this can go much beyond it. If we start to understand our consumer and our agents far better using data signals that are getting generated through the transactions, I think that's where the profitability for the agent network managers on a long term will come out. I think these are early days. I think most of the agent network managers across the world typically earn their margins through fee income and transactions. But I genuinely believe that the next 5 years will change the flavors from transactional fee earning to data monetization and a few other business models that will come around.
Interesting. So Abhinav, talk to us about how you've kind of expanded your portfolio of products or use cases to customers over time. And have you had that chance already to kind of monetize some of their kind of from what you're learning from kind of customer behavior, et cetera?
Sure.
But talk to us, what Echo has been around since 2014. You started working mostly with remittances, kind of basically cash in, cash out, how you've grown your portfolio today.
Sure. Again, let me just take back and share that, most of us, most of the agent network managers across the globe, we end up servicing a consumer segment, which is very large typically in our countries. And these are people who are earning and spending in cash. And the reason they are earning in cash is because they are typically employed in the non-formal economy in each of our countries, and as a result of which their wages are in cash. But because their wages are in cash doesn't mean that they don't have a smartphone, doesn't mean that they don't consume data, and doesn't mean that they don't have their needs across many different categories of products. And for instance, they may be consuming education products, they may be consuming media products, they may be consuming mobile gaming products, they may be consuming electronic books, So what I typically see is that, payments are built for customers who are earning electronically like you and me, but payments are not being thought about innovatively for people who are earning in cash. And what we've done in India is that we've opened up almost every category of brands, whether it is education, whether it is mobile gaming, whether it is like ebooks, and many other non-financial services categories that we've opened up. And we've converted ourselves into a cash payment gateway, where any customer wanting to buy or wanting to put in money into a mobile game can actually walk into an agent and put that money into the mobile game. And as soon as he switches on his game on his mobile, on his smartphone, he can see his wallet on that particular mobile game topped up. This can be, he can buy an electronic book at an agent point. He can get enrolled on an online course at an agent point, and therefore what we've really thought about is that we've opened up all the categories that typically are open for you and me when it comes to online payments, and we've opened up all those categories thinking about a very large segment of people who are earning in cash in our respective countries where we run our networks. And that's how we are thinking about increasing the use cases for customers to actually walk into these agents to do the transaction. This helps in multiple ways. We get a lot of consumer insight data on what consumers are consuming in excess of financial services. These are extra use cases that agents are able to process transactions for which they end up earning, and these also eventually contribute to margins for networks like ours.
Excellent.
So I would really encourage, agents across the world to actually open up their networks for brands beyond financial services. And our experience with mobile gaming, which is such a fantastically growing category, is very, very strong in India. And I would recommend that similar brands and similar categories are open for by network operators across the world.
Excellent, Abhinav. And kind of now turning to Ayaz to speak kind of from his experience from other markets and maybe some of their also countries that are kind of resemble Indonesia in terms of scale and stage of digital transformation. And you work very closely with policymakers kind of across the globe as they deliberate on how to create enabling environment for effective agent banking. Any kind of thoughts, the latest thinking, latest trends from the countries you're working with on kind of innovative business models that address this kind of last mile distribution and importantly, the scalability and profitability of the entire network?
Yeah, thanks Anna, and thanks Abhinav for such an exciting discussion on your venture in India and how you're building these agent networks. I think one of the key trends that we are starting to see really happening across many geographies is countries and regulators in particular actually harnessing e-commerce platforms in a way, and new business models in a way to really drive agent networks. If you look at what's happening in Indonesia, for instance, with the likes of the ride-hailing services, the Grabs, the Gojeks, but also other e-commerce platforms that are really leveraging and building last-mile agent infrastructure using their existing networks, using taxi drivers, using small retail shops and warehouses and agri-dealers, etc. This is really a new trend that is happening on a large scale. And as you said, Anna, it really depends on the level of digitalization of the economies and of the countries. So obviously, I've done quite a bit of work in China, for instance, and in China, where you have now close to 900,000 agents, what you're seeing is that it's really been advanced by e-commerce companies, by the Taobao business models and the other e-commerce platforms that have rolled out their agents across the country, in almost every county and every region, every town in China. And what's happening is now what the regulators are looking at is how do you actually create some kind of harmony or harmonization in the agent network between the traditional banking agents, in a sense, and also the agents that have been built by all these new businesses and the e-commerce platforms, etc. And how do you reintegrate both together? And how do you create sort of a not just a level playing field, but also an infrastructure that really allows the financial sector at large, not just e-commerce companies and ride-hailing services, but also financial institutions, to all together harness that infrastructure and start also harnessing all the data that is generated by that infrastructure to actually advance financial services. And so in a way, if you see the context of a very mature market like China, in a sense, what you're starting to see is a whole range of agents between e-commerce, traditional banking agents. Some of them are businesses, some of them are government outlets actually that don't have any other activity but just being agents for transactions. And what China is doing right now is that they are actually revisiting, in a sense, the existing agent banking arrangements and the existing agent regulations to understand how to make that network more interoperable, how to enhance the types of agents that can operate in the market, how to increase the level of transactions that agents can actually, or the range of transactions that create a data sharing framework and mechanism that really allows all the data generated by all of these agents to be used by all the parties involved in a country. And so this is really an attempt at, after having built out a strong agent network through alternative business models to traditional financial institutions, it's really an attempt to now create sort of the harmonization framework to really harness it. And in many ways, this experience, just like the Indonesian experience, is actually inspiring a lot of African markets where I also work, where you see more and more DFS providers and regulators and policymakers actually trying to harness the potential of e-commerce platforms and other alternative new business models in the way they harness their ecosystems, and they actually reach the last mile, particularly in rural areas, to actually advance financial inclusion. And you know, if you go to the other end of the spectrum, taking another country that's perhaps comparable to Indonesia as well, at least in terms of size and scale, if you look at Brazil, for instance, the trajectory of Brazil has been completely different, right? They really started from agents coming from the postal service that was auctioned out to banks for banks to be able to build traditional banking agents of the postal networks. And in a sense, this has really fueled the growth of agents in Brazil. And there's probably less agents driven by new models like e-commerce, like we see in Indonesia, in Brazil, because of the trajectory that they have been following. But now this is going to happen with the new instant payment systems and other developments in the market that are really going to allow new business models to emerge, faster transactions, and new types of agents to participate as well. And so what I am trying to say here is that you really see a very broad spectrum. And Indonesia obviously is one of the very advanced countries and advanced markets on that spectrum. But if we look at the experience from China, and maybe I will pause here, and I know I'm struggling a little bit with my connection this morning. It's early here. I apologize if my voice breaks up a little bit. But you know, if we see the lessons from China, what we can really see is that in a highly digitalized economy, where a lot of the transactions now are really digital. So once the customers have passed the hurdle of cash in, cash out, they're now in a digital space and mostly transacting digitally. The question of agent sustainability becomes a very important question. The question of the agent business model and profitability becomes a very important question. The question of how do you enable a layer of agent managers and agent network managers to increase the operational efficiency of your agents when the revenue generated is already sort of very limited in a sense, because most transactions are digital, becomes an issue. And so what China is really now grappling with is a lot of these questions around how do we introduce additional layers in the management of the agent networks? How do we review the commission structure? How do we review the range of transactions to make it much more profitable and much more sustainable in a sense? And these are sort of the type of new frontier questions that emerge once you've reached that level of maturity and once you've established such a broad agent network, in a sense, that's already covering your entire country.
I think another
Over to you, Anna.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ayaz. And I think another, I mean, you've mentioned a number of kind of important questions that come up as, you know, kind of the ecosystem evolves and new innovative models emerge. And kind of the question that comes up often when you discuss agent banking in Indonesia or elsewhere, what about risk management? How do we ensure that we don't overlook issues as important as consumer protection or financial system risk? So how do you think about risk management in this context as those kind of like new models are evolving so rapidly? Maybe we'll start with you, Ayaz, and then turn to Abhinav, how he thinks about it as he is building Echo and collaborating with others. Over to you. Maybe Ayaz.
Yeah, so it's really a question. Thank you, Anna. So it's really a question of trade-off, and how do you want to manage the trade-off? If you look at the traditional risks related to agent networks, they will be mostly around consumer protection, as you mentioned, but also market power in a sense. And particularly as we see a platformification of the economy, if you would like, and big platforms emerging that roll out agent networks, obviously, given their scale and size, they might be monopolizing the infrastructure in terms of agents. This is pretty much what happened in China, by the way, where I think the e-commerce platforms and the Taobao model in particular has really established a dominant position as it relates to the agent network. And so the reaction of the regulator was to say, great, but all the data that is generated in that agent network in terms of transactions has to be made available to all the participants in the financial sector in a sense. And so they have brought this back into the formal financial system by making that data available to banks and financial institutions and by sharing it more largely. I think it's really a question of where do you want to draw the line and which kind of trade-offs as a regulator or as a policymaker you're actually willing to make, because you need to manage sort of system risk in a sense, and you need to manage also the infrastructure risk in a sense, and you also need to drive financial inclusion. And so really the question is, how do you manage those trade-offs, and how do you build a test and learn approach? Because if you are becoming very strict in the way you regulate agents, there's a number of things that you are not going to be allowing. There's innovative business models like roaming agents that can actually provide doorstep services, door to door, and really in remote rural areas or in islands, you see a lot of boats being agents being on a boat and navigating from one island to the next and providing doorstep services. All these interesting models are extremely helpful in driving inclusion of different segments of the population and different pockets in different geographies. And really the question is then, how do you manage the risks related to or brought by these new models while also allowing innovation to happen and fintech innovation to happen of the likes of Echo in India? And I think this is where you see different responses from different jurisdictions. As I said, in China, the regulator really stepped in and said, we need all of that data to be shared with the entire ecosystem. There's other markets where regulators actually require specific types of agents to be in fixed locations, formal businesses, have different types of licenses and have a certain level of infrastructure available, which is good in terms of consumer protection, but also in many ways limits the penetration and the reach of these agents because of the constraints. And so that might work for urban, semi-urban areas, but much less for remote rural areas in a sense. And so really what's emerging as an approach is first to have a risk-based approach to regulating those agents, and also really enable and implement a test and learn approach with sandboxing, with RegTech and SupTech, with tools that allow regulators to test different type of business models, different type of agents, and be able to actually measure what's really the risk profile and what's the level of risk of that type of agent, and how do I then adopt a service-based regulatory approach as opposed to sort of a type of agent base. So you really look at the services offered by agents, and obviously an agent that only offers bill payment will be presenting much less risk than an agent that allows cash in, for instance. And so in many ways, one might think about enabling a lot of doorstep services, mobile agents, innovative models for specific types of services that are lower risk, and maybe have a bit more control over agents that are higher risk because of the nature of their activity. And I think because of and I will stop with this, because of the proliferation of new business models, because FMCG companies are also digitalizing their businesses and potentially rolling out a lot of agents, I think we have the potential to use all these fintech developments and all these new agents to really significantly expand outreach and footprint. And so the question for me is not necessarily to stop that innovation, but really to manage it in a way on a service-based, risk-based approach, and adopting a test and learn approach to defining regulations. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you so much, IS. And I was just informed that, I mean, this is such an interesting conversation, but we very quickly ran out of time. I apologize, because I just really wanted to kind of dig a little bit deeper also on some of the risk management approaches in India, and speak of some of the kind of the lessons you highlighted from other markets and its applicability in Indonesia. But I think we've gotten a lot, kind of a glimpse of what's happening around the world. Interesting models of how agent banking is kind of pushing the frontier, but also by fintech building this kind of more extensive agent banking models, but also being, as Abhinav put it in one of our conversations, also kind of empowering the ecosystem, being the tech provider to the existing to the existing network. So I think there are a number of lessons there to be taken into account for as kind of Indonesian stakeholders, the regulators, as well as industry players are thinking the way forward of multiple types of agents kind of coexisting and advancing the frontier, and ensuring that in a few years, by 2024, most of Indonesians would have access to financial services. So thank you so much, Abhinav and Ayaz, for this kind of, I think, beginning of this conversation, but I think a lot of wonderful kind of thoughts and guidance already came up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all speakers for a very, very exciting discussion on FinTech today. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the session in the limelight, how FinTech can support Indonesia's agent networks to advance financial inclusion at the last mile, marks the end of the official closing ceremony of Indonesia FinTech Summit 2020 and Pekan Fintech Nasional 2020 virtual event. We thank His Excellency, the Vice President of the Republic of Indonesia, for officiating this important event. Thank you as well to their Excellencies, Deputy Senior Governor of Bank Indonesia, Vice Chairman of OJK, all panelists and moderators, to all our virtual guests from Indonesia and around the world. A reminder, at 1:15 p.m., we will have our classroom sessions. There will be 4 simultaneous sessions on big themes. First, navigating payment system to unlock the potential of digital economy in the era of continuous disruption, FinTech 360 degrees, less is more, the LT-based solution for efficient trade finance. And then the second one, infrastructure and technology, FinTech 360 degrees, evolving landscape of FinTech lending in Indonesia. And then we have technology supervision now and future, FinTech 360 degrees, crowdfunding and digital democratization. And also we have FinTech Sharia, FinTech 360 degrees, digital innovation in Islamic social finance. We will now break for lunch and we still continue the program. There are 4 breakout sessions with 4 topics and we'll start at 1 p.m. Please be sure to join the informative and interesting speakers and please join us 5 minutes before the break session. Thank you very much and please enjoy your lunch.